The tin pail hit the ground before Mara even realized her hands had let it go. It was not the cold that made her drop it. The cold had never bothered her. She had grown up in this part of the country, in the village of Ashfield, where winters arrived early and left late, and showed no mercy to anyone who had not learned to live with them. She had learned. She had been learning since she was 7 years old, following her mother through the snow-dusted yard, with her little hands tucked under her arms, to keep them warm, watching the way her mother scattered grain, without wasting a single piece. That lesson had stayed with her. The lesson about the cold had stayed too. What made her drop the pail was the sound. It came from the other side of the old stone wall, low, sharp, and brief. Not a voice, not an animal, something else. Something she could not immediately name, and that was the part that stopped her. In 23 years of living in this cottage, she had learned every sound this land made. The creak of the oak tree near the north fence when the wind pushed it. The particular way the stream beyond the field sounded different in March than it did in October. The difference between a fox moving through the hedgerow and a deer pressing through the same space. She knew all of it, the way a person knows their own heartbeat, without thinking, without effort. But this sound, she did not know. She stood still. The chickens moved around her feet, unbothered, tilting their heads and looking at the scattered grain that had fallen when the pail dropped. The rooster, a thick-necked bird she had named Harold without ever saying the name out loud to anyone, gave her a single irritated look and then went back to pecking at the ground. The morning was still half dark, the kind of half dark that sits just before the sky, makes up its mind whether it will be gray or something better. Mara bent down slowly and picked up the pail. She held it against her side and looked at the wall. It was old, that wall. Older than anyone in Ashfield could properly say. The stones were large and smooth on the outside, and rough on the inside, where they had been split, and moss had grown between them, in long green lines that turned bright after rain, and faded to gray in the dry weeks of summer. The wall ran along the entire eastern side of her property, and then turned north, and continued, until it met the corner of the estate, the vast estate that had stood on the other side of her yard for as long as the wall had stood. She had never thought much about the wall. It was simply there. It had always been there, the way mountains are simply there, and you stop seeing them after a while, even though they are enormous. She had stopped seeing it. Until this morning, when it made a sound she did not recognize. She waited another moment. Nothing came. The chickens went on eating. Harold stretched one wing out, and then folded it back, and then lost interest in whatever he had been stretching for. The sky made its decision. Gray, after all. And the light that came was flat and cool, and turned everything in the yard the color of old pewter. Mara finished the feeding. She scattered the rest of the grain in the careful, practiced arc she always used, starting from the left and moving to the right, covering the whole stretch of yard so the smaller birds in the back had as much chance as the bold ones in the front. She watched them for a moment after. There was always a moment, just after the feeding, when she simply watched them. She could not have explained why. It was the same reason she stood on her doorstep in the evening sometimes, and watched the last light leave the sky. Some things were worth a moment of attention, even if you could not say exactly what they were worth it for. Then she picked up the empty pail, turned, and walked back to the cottage. She did not look at the wall again. But she thought about the sound all morning. Mara's full name was Mara Ellison. She had been Mara Ellison for 23 years, ever since she married Owen Ellison in the small church at the center of Ashfield on a Saturday in June, when she was 19 years old. Before that, she had been Mara Holt. She had gone to school under that name, learned to read under that name, helped her mother in the garden under that name, and buried her father under that name the year she turned 16. She had been Holt for 19 years, and Ellison for 23, which meant that the name Ellison had now been hers longer, but she still sometimes thought of herself as Holt, in a deep, quiet way she never mentioned to anyone. Owen had died 6 years ago. He had been working on the roof of the old barn, their neighbor Frank's barn, not even their own, when the latter gave way. He had not died at once, which was the part that had been hardest. He had lived for 11 days after, lying in the back bedroom with his hands very still on the blanket, and Mara had sat beside him for all 11 of those days, and had talked to him, and read to him, and sometimes just sat without doing either, because sometimes the best you can do for a person is simply be in the room with them. After Owen died, people in the village had expected Mara to collapse. Not because they were cruel. They were not. most of them, but because that was the usual shape of grief in their experience. A woman loses her husband, and for a time the world falls apart and then slowly comes back together. They had expected the falling apart part. It did not come, or not the way they expected. Mara grieved. She was not a stone. She grieved in the mornings, mostly, in that first half hour before the day properly started, when there was nothing to do yet, and the quiet was full of all the spaces where Owen used to be. She grieved when she found his handwriting on an old note tucked inside a kitchen drawer. She grieved the first winter without him, when the firewood ran low and she had to figure out on her own how to split the larger pieces, and she spent an entire afternoon in the yard swinging the axe and missing and trying again, and she grieved the whole time she was doing it, not stopping, just doing the work and grieving at the same time because that was the only way she knew to handle both things at once. But she did not collapse. The chickens still needed feeding. Her daughter, Clara, had been 14 when Owen died, and her son, Peter, had been 11. They had needed feeding too, in every sense of that word. You do not collapse when people need feeding. You get up in the morning, and you go to the yard, and you scatter the grain, and you do it again the next morning. Clara was grown now, married, living in the town of Ellsworth, which was 40 miles east, and might as well have been a different country for how often she came back. She was happy there. Mara was glad of that. Peter had gone north to work on the fishing boats 2 years ago, and sent money home every month with a short letter, always written in his big, uneven handwriting, on whatever paper he could find, sometimes a page torn from a notebook, and sometimes just the back of an old receipt. Mara kept every one of those letters in the tin box on the shelf above the kitchen fireplace. She lived alone now, which was not the same as being lonely. This was a distinction she had spent some time working out in her own mind, and she was satisfied with it. Being alone meant there was no one else in the house. Being lonely meant you were missing something you needed. She was alone. She had the chickens and the garden and the village, where she went twice a week to buy what she could not grow herself. And she had her neighbors, and she had the rhythm of her days, which was as reliable as the movement of the sun, and which she found, in an honest and unromantic way, deeply comforting. Her days had a shape. She liked the shape. The shape started with the chickens. She was always up before the full light. She had been this way her whole life. Owen had been the opposite. He had loved his sleep, had burrowed into it the way a man buries himself in a warm coat on a cold night, and she had always been the one to rise first and let him have the last of the dark and the quiet. She rose early now out of 40 years of practice, and also because, if she was honest, she liked the world in that early state before it had fully committed to being the day. It felt like hers in a way it did not later, when everyone else woke up and took their share of it. She would dress, go down, put the kettle on. She would have her tea standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard, which at that hour was mostly shadow and the dim shapes of the chickens in their coop. She would finish the tea. Then she would put on her coat and her boots, the heavy ones with the thick soles, not the lighter pair she wore in the dry summer months, and she would take the grain pail from its hook by the door and go out. The yard was not large. It was enclosed on 3 sides by a low fence she and Owen had built together the summer before Peter was born, and on the 4th side by the eastern wall, the old stone wall, the one that had made the sound this morning, the one she had not thought about in years. She went out every morning, and she fed the chickens, and she watched them for a moment after, and then she went back inside. That was the start of the day. After that came everything else, the garden work in the seasons when there was garden work, the washing, the mending, the walk to the village and back, the cooking, the reading in the evenings by the fire. All of it had its place. All of it had its time. She was, most people in Ashfield agreed, a steady woman. Not cold, not unfriendly. Steady. The kind of steady that is built over years, from learning how to carry things without showing the weight of them. The baker's wife, Dorothy, who was Mara's closest friend in the village, sometimes said that if Mara Ellison ever worried about anything, you would never know it from looking at her. Mara always smiled when Dorothy said this, and did not confirm or deny it. The truth was that she worried about things the same as anyone. She simply did not see the use in letting the worry take up more space than the problem itself. She was thinking about all of this, or not exactly thinking, more letting these things move through her mind the way water moves through a familiar channel, while she made her breakfast that morning. Eggs from the chickens. A slice of bread toasted on the rack above the fire. butter that she bought from the farm at the top of the lane. She ate at the kitchen table, looking at the wall of the room rather than out the window, because she did not want to see the yard right now. Or rather, she did not want to examine why she did not want to see the yard right now. The sound from the wall had unsettled something in her. She did not like being unsettled. It was not fear exactly. It was more the feeling you get when a thing you have always taken for granted suddenly reminds you that it exists. The wall existed. Something had happened on the other side of it this morning. These two facts sat in her mind, and she could not quite put them away. She finished breakfast and washed the dishes. She put on her coat and her lighter boots. The day was going to be dry. She could tell from the color of the sky through the window, and she went out the front door and walked to the village. Dorothy was behind the counter when Mara came into the bakery. The smell hit her the moment she pushed the door open. Warm bread, something sweet, the deep yeasty richness that had lived in this shop for as long as the shop had existed. Dorothy looked up and immediately said, without preamble, the way people who have known each other for decades speak, "You look like something's on your mind." "Good morning to you too," Mara said. Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron. She was a small woman, with quick brown eyes, and silver hair she wore, pinned back in a style that had not changed in 30 years. "I'll take a good morning, but I'll also take an answer." Mara bought her bread and her small bag of flour, and stood at the counter for a moment. "Have you ever heard anything strange from the estate side of the wall?" Dorothy put her head to one side. "What sort of strange?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking." Dorothy considered this. "The new man is there," she said at last. "Or not new exactly. He's been there 8 months now. But no one's seen much of him. He keeps to himself completely." She leaned slightly forward. "The Duke's family, you know. It's the son of the old Duke's second cousin, something like that. His name is Edouard something or other. He had a great big estate somewhere else and lost it, or sold it, or something happened. And now he's in that old house next to your wall." "I didn't know anyone had moved in," Mara said. "Well, you wouldn't. He doesn't exactly announce himself." Mara tucked the bread under her arm. 8 months. 8 months. Dorothy looked at her steadily. "Have you been hearing things?" "Just once, this morning." Mara paused. "Probably nothing." "Probably," Dorothy agreed. But there was a small, thoughtful look on her face that she did not quite manage to put away before Mara saw it. Mara said goodbye and walked home. She took the long way back, which added 10 minutes to the walk, but went through the lower part of the village, past the church and the old graveyard, and the field that had been fallow for 2 years, and was now thick with tall grass, and the particular kind of wildflower that moves in a certain way when the wind comes across a flat field, almost like water. She liked this part of the walk. She did not know exactly why she was taking it today when she usually took the short route, but she let herself take it without asking too many questions about it. She stopped at Owen's grave. She did this every week or so, not on any fixed schedule, but when she felt pulled to it. She stood for a minute with her hand on the top of the headstone, which was cold from the morning air, and she did not say anything out loud. She had long since stopped feeling that she needed to say things out loud. She just stood there. That seemed to be enough. Then she went home. The afternoon passed quietly. She did the mending she had been putting off. 2 of her working aprons needed the ties replaced, and she had a pair of trousers that belonged to Peter, left behind when he went north, that she was mending out of habit, even though she was not sure when she would see him next to give them back. The needle moved through the cloth steadily. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted, in the way it does in October, going from flat gray to a warmer, more amber light in the last 2 hours before dark. She thought about the sound from the wall once or twice, but she did not think about it long. Whatever it was, it had not come again. The yard was still, the chickens were settled. The world on the other side of that old stone wall was not her world, and that was a simple and sufficient fact. At least, it had always been. She made her supper. She read for an hour after, sitting in the chair by the fire with a novel, borrowed from Dorothy, who had strong and reliable opinions about which novels were worth reading, and which ones were not. She went to bed when the fire started to die down. She slept well, which was not always the case in the colder months. When she woke it was still dark, the proper darkness of early morning, and she lay for a moment in the warmth of the blankets and listened to the sound of the house. The small sounds, the settling of old timber, the distant pull of the wind against the roof. that she had been listening to for 23 years. Everything was as it should be. She got up, she dressed, she put the kettle on, she had her tea at the window, and then she went out to feed the chickens. The yard was cold and still. The sky was doing that thing again, where it could not decide whether to be night or morning, caught in the thin space between. She unhooked the pail. She walked to the coop and opened it, and the birds came filing out in their usual order, which never seemed to change no matter how many times she observed it. Harold first, slow and important, looking at her with the ancient skepticism of a bird that has survived many winters and trusts no one. She began to scatter the grain. She was halfway through when she felt it. Not a sound this time. Not exactly. More of a presence. The feeling you get when someone is watching you. The particular awareness that arrives before you have any concrete reason for it. Before you have heard or seen anything. She had felt this feeling before in her life. Twice before, to be precise. Once as a child, when she had been playing in the barn and turned to find a fox standing in the doorway, watching her with calm, golden eyes. And once, when Owen had come home early from town, on her birthday, 30 years ago, and stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her cook, saying nothing, waiting for her to notice. Both times the feeling had been the same. Still, alert, not frightened, just suddenly, completely aware. She finished scattering the grain. She kept her movements even and unhurried. She did not look at the wall. But she knew, as clearly as she had ever known anything, that someone was standing on the other side of it. She picked up the empty pail. She allowed herself one slow look in the direction of the wall. There was nothing to see. Just the old stones, moss-lined and gray in the early light, solid and silent and giving nothing away. She went inside. She set the pail down on the kitchen floor. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, not moving, not thinking clearly yet. Then she went to the window, the kitchen window that faced the yard and the wall, and she stood there and she looked out, and the yard was empty of everything except her chickens, and the wall was just a wall. But her heart was beating a little faster than it should have been, for a morning that had, by any practical measure, produced nothing unusual at all. She did not know his name yet. She did not know he was a duke. She did not know anything about the person on the other side of that wall except that he had been there 2 mornings in a row now, and that she had felt it both times, and that the feeling was not one she had experienced in a very long time. She turned from the window and started making her breakfast, and she told herself very firmly that she was not going to think about this, and for a while she almost succeeded. The day passed. The next morning came. She went out with the pail, and felt it again. Eduard von Hartmann had not slept properly in 14 months. He had not told anyone this. There was no one to tell, first of all, and second of all, even if there had been, he would not have said it. He was not a man who spoke easily about what was happening inside him. He had been raised not to. His father had been a man of very few words and almost no visible feelings, and his father's father before him had been the same, and so Eduard had grown up understanding that the interior of a man was a private place, and that talking about it at length was a form of indulgence that the world did not particularly need. This was not to say he was cold. He was not cold. He was simply contained. He had arrived at the estate in Ashfield 8 months ago, on a cold, overcast afternoon in February, with 2 trunks and a leather case, and a heart so heavy that he had felt, sitting in the carriage as it rolled through the village, that it might actually be physically heavier than it was supposed to be, that if a doctor were to open his chest and take it out and weigh it, it would register as something denser and more solid than an ordinary human heart. His wife had died 16 months before that. Her name had been Catherine. She had been 39 years old. She had been healthy, or everyone had believed so, and then in the space of 4 months, she had become not healthy, and then very unwell, and then she had died. The doctors had used a particular word for what had taken her, a word Eduard had learned, and then spent the following year wishing he did not know. He had stood at her bedside at the end, as Mara had stood at Owen's. He had held her hand. He had watched her face, which even at the end was the face he had known for 17 years, and he had thought, very clearly, you cannot do this, and she had done it anyway, because that is the nature of death, which does not ask permission, and does not accept arguments. After Catherine died, He had tried to continue living as they had lived together. He had tried this for about 4 months. He stayed in the estate that had been theirs together, in the part of the country where they had made their life. He went through the days. He saw the people he was supposed to see, attended the functions he was expected to attend, appeared where he was expected to appear. He did all of this, and he did it correctly, from the outside, and on the inside it felt exactly like being in a room, where all the furniture was the same, but the light had changed in a way that made everything look wrong. After 4 months of this, he stopped. He sold the estate. He withdrew from all the functions and the appearances. He wrote letters to the people who had expected things from him, and explained, as briefly and politely as he could, that he was going to be away for some time. Then he went away. He had gone first to the coast and stayed there for 6 weeks, living in a small house near the sea, and walking on the beach every day, and sleeping badly, and eating without interest, and reading books without taking in much of what he read. The sea helped a little, or not helped exactly. The sea was large and indifferent in a way that had a strange and specific comfort. It reminded him that the world was very big, and had been there long before him, and would be there long after, and that his grief, which felt enormous to him, was not a particularly remarkable event in the long history of the world. This was not a happy thought, but it was a steady thought. He held on to it. After the coast, he had looked for somewhere quiet and without associations, somewhere he had never been with Catherine, somewhere her absence could not layer itself over a specific landscape, and specific rooms, and specific views from specific windows. His solicitor had found the estate in Ashfield. It was smaller than anything he had lived in before, which suited him. It had been uninhabited for years and needed work, which also suited him, because work, he had found, was one of the few things that could still fully occupy his attention. He had come in February, and he had spent the first 3 months working alongside the small crew of men the solicitor had hired, stripping and repairing and fixing and rebuilding. He had learned things. He had learned how to lay a proper floor, and how to point the mortar between old stones, and how to hang a door so that it swings without catching. He had bruised his hands and his shins, and twice his pride. He had slept, those first 3 months, the way a man sleeps when his body is genuinely tired, which was not the same as peaceful sleep, but was better than the alternative. Then the work was mostly done, and the men went home, and Edouard was alone in the repaired house in Ashfield, and the nights became long and quiet, and the not sleeping came back. He began walking at night. He did this carefully, going no farther than the grounds of the estate, staying within the wall that enclosed the property. He had learned the grounds in the dark the way you learn a room you live in, without looking, by feel and by memory, and by the subtle changes in texture underfoot. He knew where the path turned soft near the old oak. He knew the spot near the eastern wall where the ground dipped slightly, where you had to step more carefully or you would catch your foot on the edge of the dip and stumble. The eastern wall. He had been walking near the eastern wall one night in late September when he first heard her. He had not seen her. It was not yet dawn, and the light was not enough to see anything clearly, but he had heard the sound of the gate to the coop opening, a particular creak that he had noticed before, and then the sound of grain hitting the ground, and then soft sounds, low and indistinct, which he realized after a moment were her voice. She was speaking to the birds. He could not hear the words. He was not sure there were words. Exactly. More sounds. The kind you make when you are doing something familiar and comfortable, and you are talking to the living things around you without particularly expecting an answer. He stood very still. He stood there for a long time. When she went back inside, he stayed where he was for a while longer. There was something that had happened to him in those minutes, standing on his side of the wall, that he was not immediately able to name. Not peace exactly. More like the cessation, briefly, of a particular kind of noise that had been running constantly inside him for over a year. The way a sound you have stopped noticing becomes noticeable again when it stops. He had come back the next morning. He had told himself, that first time, that he was not going to come back. He had told himself this with some conviction as he walked back to the house in the dark. He was a man with some dignity after all. Whatever strange pull he had felt standing at that wall, he was not going to stand there like a shadow and listen to his neighbor feed chickens. He was not. He was back at the wall the following morning, and the morning after that. By the third morning, he had accepted that this was something he was going to keep doing, and he had stopped arguing with himself about it. He stood at the wall in the pre-dawn dark, and he listened. And there was something in the listening, in the particular domesticity of those sounds, the grain, the birds, the quiet voice, the creak of the coop, that reached some part of him that had been closed. He did not fully understand it. He did not try to. He had found, in the past 14 months, that there were some things happening inside him that were better left without too much examination, because examination sometimes made them go away, and he needed them more than he needed to understand them. Edouard was 52 years old. He was tall, slightly stooped in the way tall men sometimes become, after years of ducking through doorways that were built for smaller people. His hair had gone gray, mostly at the temples, which gave him a look his wife had once told him was distinguished, and which he himself had never given a great deal of thought to. He had a face that was serious in repose, the kind of face that strangers often found difficult to read, which suited him because he generally preferred not to be read by strangers. His hands were large and had become, over the months of repair work, more calloused than they had ever been in his previous life, and he looked at this change sometimes with something that was close to satisfaction. He was not entirely without knowledge of what he was doing at the wall each morning. He was not a foolish man. He knew that he was drawn there by loneliness, and by the particular quality of that woman's presence, something he could barely see and could not describe, something that was communicated through sounds and movements at a distance, but which was entirely real and entirely specific to her. He had been watching her, in the technical sense, for over a month now. He had seen enough to form some impression. She was orderly and unhurried. She did things the same way each morning, with the precision of someone who has found through long experience the most efficient and least wasteful way to do something. She did not rush, she did not lag. She worked with the calm, competent attention of a person who respects the task they are doing, even a small task, even a task that is repeated every morning without variation. He admired this. He admired it deeply, in a way that surprised him. In the world he had come from, the world of estates and functions and appearances, the small repeated tasks of daily life were things that other people did. Invisible people. People who were there when needed, and otherwise not part of the scene. He had never in his life scattered grain to chickens. He had certainly never watched anyone else do it as though it were something worth watching, but it was. He did not quite understand why it was, but it was. He had also, over the course of these October mornings, begun to understand that she knew he was there. He was not entirely sure when this had become clear to him. It was not that she had said anything or done anything direct. It was more in the way she moved, the way she kept her attention on the chickens and the grain, without the slightly forced quality of someone who is genuinely unaware of a presence. She was too natural about her naturalness, if that made any sense. The ease was real, but it was also deliberate. You can only be that deliberately easy about something if you have made a decision to be easy about it. She had decided, he thought, to behave as though he was not there. She had not decided that he was not there. This distinction occupied his thoughts more than was probably useful. He had done nothing about it. He did not know what doing something about it would even look like. He could not climb over the wall and introduce himself while she was feeding chickens at 5 in the morning. He could not send a letter. What would it even say? He was not the sort of person who made moves of that kind, in any case. In his own life, in his own world, introductions had always happened through established channels, through known people who knew both parties and could make the proper connections in the proper ways. He did not know anyone in Ashfield. He had spoken to almost no one since arriving. The crew of workmen had been the closest thing to company, and even with them he had mostly communicated through the foreman, a reliable man named George who asked clear questions and accepted clear answers, and did not seem to require or desire conversation beyond the practical. Edouard respected George enormously for this. The solicitor came once a month from town to review the accounts and report on various matters that Edouard could have handled in letters, but which the solicitor preferred to handle in person, which Edouard had come to understand was simply the way the solicitor was, and which was not worth objecting to. The solicitor's name was Harold, coincidentally the same name as Mara's rooster, though Edouard would not know this for some time, and he was a trim, careful man who was discreet in a way that suggested long practice with clients who needed discretion. He had mentioned to Edouard, in an offhand way that was not entirely offhand, that the property immediately to the west, the small cottage with the yard and the chickens, was owned by a woman named Ellison, Mara Ellison, widow, long established in the village, Very well regarded. Edward had said simply, yes. Harold had looked at him for a moment, and then moved on to the accounts. On the morning of October the 23rd, he did not know that she would later remember this date, would remember it for years, with the clarity that belongs to turning points that only reveal themselves as turning points later. He was standing in his usual place, near the eastern wall, when the sound happened. He had been leaning, slightly, against the outer face of the wall, which he sometimes did when the standing became uncomfortable. He was a tall man, and the waiting was long, and his back, which had troubled him intermittently since an injury some years before, sometimes made itself known. He had shifted his weight, and his boot had caught the loose stone, a stone he had noticed before and meant to move, and had not moved, and it had shifted and then fallen, making a sharp, low sound against the base of the wall, and then everything had gone still. He had heard the pail hit the ground on the other side. He had closed his eyes for a moment. Then he had walked quietly back to the house in the dark and gone inside, and stood in his kitchen with his coat still on, and understood that she now knew, with certainty, that there was someone there. He had not gone back the next morning, or the morning after. He had stayed away for 4 days, which was harder than he expected it to be. And during those 4 days, he thought about what it meant that it was hard. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the way grief works, how it does not leave cleanly, how it hangs in you in a way that is part permanent and part changing, and how you can go for weeks thinking you have learned its shape, and then something small happens, and you find there is a part of it you had not yet met. He thought about the question of what exactly he was doing. He was a man standing in the dark on his side of a wall, listening to a woman he had never spoken to feed her chickens. That was the fact of it, stripped down. It was an unusual fact. He was aware that it was unusual. He was aware that his reasons for doing it were not simple, but they were also not anything he was ashamed of, exactly. He was drawn to her in a way that he could feel but not fully articulate, and he was too old, and had been through too much to pretend that such feelings did not exist, or to wave them away with the kind of self-important reasoning that says a man in my position does not have such feelings. A man in his position had them anyway. On the 5th morning, he went back. He went earlier than usual, when the dark was still complete, and he stood away from the loose stone and he listened, and after a while the coop opened, and she came out with the pail, and she scattered the grain in her careful, practiced arc, and she spoke softly to the birds in the way she always did, and the particular noise that had been running inside him for 14 months went quiet again, and he stood there in the cold and the dark, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, and had not had a word for until now. He felt grateful. Not for her exactly, or not only for her. He felt grateful for the existence of mornings like this one, cold and gray and unglamorous, where ordinary things happened in ordinary ways, and the world went quietly about its business. He had lost sight of this, somewhere in the long months of grief. He had lost sight of the fact that the world's ordinary going on was not an insult to what he had lost, but a proof that life was still there, still available, still proceeding in all its unremarkable detail, and that unremarkable detail was not something to be mourned or dismissed, but something to be, perhaps, held on to. He did not know this woman. He did not know her name yet, though that would change. He did not know her story, which was longer and more substantial than he could have imagined, standing there in the dark, on the wrong side of a stone wall. But something had started. He did not know its name either. He only knew that it had started, and that after 14 months of nothing starting, that fact alone was worth something. He stayed until she went inside. Then he walked back to the house, and for the first time since arriving in Ashfield, he made himself a proper breakfast. Not the usual stand at the counter with bread and cold meat that he had been surviving on. He found eggs, there were eggs, left by the housekeeper who came twice a week, and he cooked them and he ate them at the table. He ate slowly. He looked at the kitchen around him, which was a good kitchen, a well-built room with strong walls and deep windows, and a floor that he had helped lay himself last spring. He had not looked at it properly before. He looked at it now. It was a good room. He finished his breakfast and washed the dishes and went about his day. The hen that changed everything was named, though Mara had never told anyone this, Beatrice. She had named the hen in her head several months ago, when the bird had begun demonstrating a level of stubbornness and self-determination that Mara found both irritating and privately admirable. Beatrice was a brown bird, medium-sized, with a way of looking at you that suggested she had already considered all the options and found them wanting. She was not the largest hen. She was not the most productive. She was, however, by a considerable margin, the most independent. It was Beatrice who found the gap in the wall. Mara noticed it on a Tuesday morning in early November, when she came out to the yard and did her usual count, and came up one short. She counted again, still one short. She walked the perimeter of the yard slowly, checking the fence, looking for the low spots she had been meaning to reinforce since September. Everything looked solid. She reached the eastern wall, the old stone wall, and she found it. Near the base, at the northern end of the wall, where it met the remains of an old gateposts that had been sealed over years ago, two of the lower stones had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for a determined hen to notice and to decide that what was on the other side was probably better than what was on this side, because that was how Beatrice thought about the world. Then she looked beyond it, at the territory on the other side, which she could see now in a way she never had, a strip of grass, pale and frost-touched, and beyond it, the beginning of what had once been a formal garden, and was now something in between formal and wild. She could not see the house from here, just the garden. And somewhere in that garden, the hen. She could hear her, actually. The familiar mutter and scrape of chicken feet on frosted ground. Beatrice was not hiding. She was simply eating what was available to her, and had no immediate plans to return. Mara looked at the gap again. She looked at the garden on the other side. She thought for a moment about simply waiting at the gap and calling the hen back, which would have been simpler and would have required nothing of her except patience. She had patience. She was not short of patience. But she thought about the loose stone sound from 3 weeks ago. She thought about the presence she had felt at the wall. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, morning after morning, always there, and always just out of sight. She thought about what Dorothy had told her. A man living in the estate, keeping entirely to himself. 8 months of keeping to himself. She thought about all of this in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she went through the gap. The other side of the wall was different from what she had imagined, though she had not consciously realized she had imagined anything. The ground was firmer here, and the garden, which had clearly been neglected for years and was only now beginning to receive some attention, had a different quality than her own yard, more formal in its bones, with the ghost of old pathways under the overgrown grass and the remnants of what might once have been rose beds along the north-facing wall. In summer it might have had a particular kind of beauty. In November it had a different kind, the stark, structural beauty of things that have been stripped to their essential shapes. She walked forward, following the sound of Beatrice. She found the hen near a low stone bench at the edge of what had been a path. Beatrice looked up at her with an expression that communicated, very clearly, that she had been found and was not particularly concerned about this. Mara bent and picked her up with the practiced ease of someone who has handled birds for decades and knows that the key is confidence. You commit to the motion, and the bird accepts it. Beatrice tucked her head down and grumbled and went still. "Right," Mara said. "Come on." She had taken 3 steps back toward the wall when she heard him. "Good morning." It was a low voice, not deep in a theatrical way, but low in the way of a voice that has spent a long time being quiet and is now remembering how to make itself heard. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the old path, about 15 feet away. He had come from the direction of the house, but quietly, or she had been focused enough on the hen that she had not heard him approach. He was tall, that was the first thing, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely without surprise, which was its own kind of surprising. He looked as though he had been expecting something like this to happen, perhaps not in exactly this form, but something. He looked as though he had been standing at the edge of something for a long time and had just seen it arrive. He was not what she had expected. She had not known what she had expected. He was wearing work clothes, not the clothes of a working man, but good clothes, worn for practical purposes. A jacket that had been expensive once, and now had the comfortable look of something that had been lived in. His hands were at his sides. He did not move toward her, and he did not step back. He simply stood there and said good morning, and looked at her. "Good morning," she said. "I'm sorry. My hen came through the gap in the wall. I came to fetch her back." "I see," he said. There was a pause. "Is she hurt?" It was such an unexpected question. so practical, so simple, so without any of the awkwardness she had been bracing for, that she glanced down at Beatrice, almost involuntarily before answering. No, she's fine. Just had other ideas about her morning, it seems. Something moved across his face that might have been close to a smile. I'm Eduard von Hartmann, he said. I've been living here since February. I know, she said. Or I knew someone had moved in. Dorothy at the bakery told me. She paused. I'm Mara Ellison, the cottage on the other side. Yes, he said. Just yes. Not the reflexive I know, though something in the way he said it suggested he did know. She noticed this and decided not to examine it just yet. I'll get the gap mended, she said, and I'll fix my fence so she can't wander back. There's no need to worry about the fence on my account, he said. She's not causing any harm. Another pause, careful and brief. The garden is not being used. She looked at him then, properly. She had been keeping her attention partially on the hen and partially on the practical matter of the gap, the way you do when you are in a situation where your instincts tell you to stay practical. But she looked at him now. He was watching her steadily, with those eyes that were neither cold nor warm, but simply present, attentive, waiting for whatever came next. She felt, with some clarity, that this man was very lonely. Not in the surface way, the way that can be fixed by being invited to dinner, or being introduced to the right people. Lonely in the deep way, the way she had been lonely in the first year after Owen, not for company in general, but for the specific weight of another person's life running alongside your own. She recognized it because she had carried it herself. I'll mend the gap anyway, she said, because that was the right thing to say, and because she did not want him to think she was offering anything she was not ready to offer. Good day to you, Mr. von Hartmann. Good day, Mrs. Ellison. She walked back to the gap, pushed Beatrice through ahead of her, and followed her into her own yard. She closed the gap as best she could by hand. She would need proper stones to do it right. And she picked Beatrice up again, since the bird had absolutely no intention of walking to the coop on her own, and she carried her the length of the yard. She did not look back. But her hands, when she set Beatrice down, were not entirely steady. She told herself this was the cold. She told herself this for the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, with decreasing conviction. That evening she sat by the fire with Dorothy's novel, and could not read more than a paragraph without losing the thread of it. She set it down after half an hour, and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire. The fire was doing what fires do, burning in a reliable and uncomplicated way, providing warmth and light without requiring anything in return. She appreciated this quality in fires. She thought about his voice, the low, careful quality of it, the way he had asked if the hen was hurt, which was still, hours later, the detail that stuck in her mind most clearly. She could not have said why that particular detail stayed with her when she had more obvious things to think about. His face, the unexpectedness of him, the way he had said her name at the end. But it was the question about the hen that stayed. It was the question of a man who notices small things and treats them as worth noticing. Owen had been like that. She did not allow herself to linger on this comparison for very long. What she did allow herself to think about was the practicality of the situation. She had a neighbor now, a real, present neighbor, not an absent one or a theoretical one. They had exchanged names. They had spoken, briefly, in a civil and entirely proper way. This was the full extent of it. There was nothing remarkable here, nothing that required examination or consideration beyond the simple acknowledgement that she had a neighbor and she had now met him. She picked up the novel again. She managed another page before she remembered the way he had said yes, just yes, nothing more, when she had said she was from the cottage on the other side, as though the cottage on the other side was something he had some relationship with already, as though she was not the stranger in this exchange. She put the novel down again. She went to bed earlier than usual that night, and she lay in the dark, and she did not sleep for a long time, not from worry, from a kind of alertness that she had not felt for years, a sense of the world being slightly larger than it had been that morning, and of herself being slightly more awake inside it. That was the first conversation. The second one happened 3 days later, at the wall. She was mending the gap. She had spent an hour the previous morning selecting the right stones from the pile she kept at the back of the yard for exactly this kind of repair. When she heard footsteps on the other side, she kept working. She had the first stone set and was checking its fit when his voice came over the wall. "You don't have to seal it entirely, if it's inconvenient." She kept her eyes on the stone. "It's not inconvenient. I have the stones." A pause. "I meant, if she comes through again, it's not a problem. On my side." "It's a problem on mine," Mara said, without heat. "If one of them learns a gap exists, they all learn it eventually. And then I'm spending my mornings rounding them up from your garden, instead of getting on with the rest of my day." Another pause. "That's practical. I find it works better than the alternative." She could not see him, but she could feel him there, on the other side, standing close to the wall, not pressed against it, but close. She set the second stone and pushed it into place and tested it. Solid. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. She stopped. "I want to say something. I want to say it because I think it should be said, and because not saying it seems less honest than saying it." His voice was careful, like a man picking his way across uncertain ground, choosing each footstep deliberately. "I have been standing near this wall in the mornings, early in the mornings, for some weeks." She straightened up slowly. She looked at the wall. "Yes," she said, "I know." Silence. "You knew," he said, not a question. "Yes." Another silence. Then, "I'm sorry." She thought about this. She thought about whether she was owed an apology, and whether she felt owed one. "Were you intending any harm?" "No, absolutely not." "Were you trying to frighten me?" "No. I would never." "No." "Then you don't need to apologize," she said. "But you could tell me why." The silence that followed was the longest yet. She counted it in heartbeats, which was not something she was in the habit of doing. She got to 11 before he spoke. "Because," he said, "I have been very quiet for a very long time. And your mornings are not quiet. They are ordinary. But ordinary in a way that I had forgotten existed, and I needed to be near it. I did not mean to become something that unsettled you. I understand if I have." She stood with her hands on the top of the wall and looked at the stones. She looked at the moss in the cracks, which had been growing here since long before either of them existed. She looked at the sky above the wall, which was the white of cold November, with the faint suggestion, far in the east, of something that might be blue. "You haven't unsettled me," she said at last. "Not in a way I cannot manage." She picked up her remaining stone and set it into the gap and pressed it firm. "Good day, Mr. von Hartmann," she said. "Good day," he said. She gathered her tools and went inside. She made her tea and stood at the window and looked at the wall, solid and gray and complete now, the gap sealed. She stood there for a long time. The basket appeared on a Friday. Mara found it when she came in from the morning feeding, or rather, she found it when she went out the front of the house to bring in the firewood she had stacked beside the door the evening before, and nearly walked into it. It was sitting on the stone step, a proper basket, well made, with a woven lid held shut by a small wooden latch. She stood and looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. Inside, a round loaf of bread, dark and dense, the kind that takes a long time to bake and goes well with everything. A block of good yellow cheese, wrapped in cloth. A small glass jar with a tight-fitting lid, full of honey, that was the dark, clear amber of autumn. No note, no name, nothing written anywhere. She did not need a note. She set the basket on her kitchen table. She stood beside it and looked at it, the way you look at something that has asked you a question without speaking. The bread smelled good. It was fresh, probably from yesterday. The cheese was the kind she knew from the town, better than anything available in the village, which meant it had been brought from some distance. The honey caught the light from the window and glowed in its jar. She thought about it for the length of time it took her to drink her morning tea. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she picked up the basket, and she walked out to the yard and across to the wall. She considered, briefly, whether to put it through the gap she had just mended, but that seemed wrong. Breaking her own repair work, to return someone's gift. Instead, she lifted the basket, which was not heavy, and set it on top of the wall. She pressed it firmly into a flat section between the uneven upper stones so that it would not fall. Then she stepped back. She went inside. She felt, as she took off her coat and hung it by the door, a complicated mixture of things. Respect for the gesture, which had been made with delicacy. No note, no expectation written into it. Nothing that demanded a response. Clarity about why she was returning it, which was not about the gift being unwanted, but about what accepting it would mean. She did not want to accept things from a man she did not know, a man whose world was as different from hers as the estate was from her cottage. Not because she was proud, exactly. Because she was careful. In the way of someone who has learned that debts of kindness can become tangled. She was also, and she acknowledged this to herself without pleasure, a little afraid. Not of him. Not of anything specific. Afraid of the feeling she had had when he had explained himself at the wall. The recognition, immediate and unwelcome, of what she had heard in his voice. That quality of someone who has been living at great distance from life and is trying to find their way back to it. She knew that quality too well. And she knew what it felt like to have something reach across that distance and pull at you. She did not want to be the thing that pulled at him if she could not be sure of what would happen when something, having been pulled, arrived. This was the reasoning she presented to herself. Underneath the reasoning was something simpler, which she did not present to herself, which was that she was not ready. She was not ready for what this might be asking of her. And after 23 years of being ready for everything, for widowhood, for solitude, for the 100 practical difficulties of a life managed alone, the feeling of not being ready was strange and a little frightening. The basket stayed on top of the wall all that day. She could see it from the kitchen window when she stood at the right angle. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something new in a familiar view. By evening it was gone. She did not know if he had taken it from his side or if it had simply blown off in the wind that came up in the late afternoon. But when she looked the next morning, the top of the wall was empty. She did not know what that meant. She was not sure she wanted to know. But she found herself, that Saturday morning, more alert than usual when she went out to feed the chickens, more present in the yard, more aware of the wall's particular silence. It was silent. He was not there. He was not there Sunday morning either, or Monday, or the 4 mornings after that. She noticed this more than she would have predicted. The presence she had become accustomed to, and she had become accustomed to it, without meaning to or choosing to, was gone, and its absence had a shape, the way the absence of a sound you did not know you were hearing has a shape when it stops. The mornings felt quieter, not in a comfortable way, in an emptier way. She did not like that she noticed. She was at the village market on the following Wednesday, when she ran into Francis Ward, who lived in the lane above the bakery, and who was, in Mara's private assessment, one of the most thorough gatherers and distributors of information in Ashfield, which was either a valuable quality or an exhausting one depending on your relationship to the information in question. Francis was examining a bolt of cloth at the dry goods stall. She looked up when she saw Mara, and her face arranged itself into the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something. "I heard you met the new man at the estate," she said, not even a hello first. "Briefly," Mara said. "My hen went through the wall." "Yes." Francis set down the cloth and turned fully. "He's a duke, you know. Or was. I looked it up. My cousin has access to the register. Eduard von Hartmann. The title is German originally, through his grandmother. He had a proper estate on the other side of the county for years. They say he sold it after his wife died. People do strange things when they grieve," Mara said. "They do. Some people." Francis paused, and the pause had a shape to it. "He came into the village last week. Did you know? First time in 8 months, apparently. He bought bread and cheese and some honey at the market. Paid fairly. Didn't say much." Mara absorbed this in silence. "I'm only telling you," Francis said, with a particular inflection, "because people are going to talk. They already are, a little. A man like that, in the house next to yours. People notice." "There is nothing to notice," Mara said. "We spoke once, for about 3 minutes, over a returned hen." "Of course," Francis said pleasantly. "I'm not suggesting there's anything to it at all. I'm only saying people will talk, and I thought it better you knew that than not." Mara thanked her. She bought what she needed and went home. She put her basket on the kitchen table. She stood and looked at it for a moment. Bread, cheese, honey. Her own groceries, bought with her own money in the village market. Exactly the same contents as the basket he had left. She had not thought about this when she was buying them, and now she stood and looked at them, and felt a peculiar sensation that was not quite amusement and not quite anything else, but was something. She put the groceries away. That afternoon she was weeding the part of the garden she used for root vegetables. The ground was still workable, barely, but another hard frost would finish it for the year, when she heard footsteps on the far side of the wall. Not the hesitant early morning presence she was used to. Clear footsteps, purposeful, moving along the inside of the wall from south to north. They stopped. She kept weeding. "Mrs. Ellison," his voice over the wall, careful as always. She sat back on her heels. "Mr. von Hartmann." A pause. "I wanted to say, about the basket, you were right to return it. I went about it the wrong way. I wanted to do something practical, and I didn't consider that I was asking something of you that you had not agreed to be asked." She looked at the wall. "What were you asking?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "That's the honest answer. I knew I wanted to acknowledge something that has been, I am not expressing this well." "No," she said. "Go on. You gave me something, without knowing it. Your mornings. The way you do what you do. Every morning. Without complaint. Without drama. I know that sounds like nothing. I know it sounds like I am describing the work of keeping chickens, and the work of keeping chickens is not interesting." A pause. "But it was interesting to me. It was more than interesting. It reached something that had been closed, in me, for a long time." She sat on the cold ground and looked at her hands, which were dirty from the gardening, and which, she thought absently, looked like the hands of someone who had been doing real work for a long time, which they were. "You lost your wife," she said. Not a question. "Yes. Not long ago. 16 months. And some days." She turned this over. "I lost my husband 6 years ago," she said. "You are still close to it." "Yes." "It doesn't get smaller," she said. "I won't tell you it does, because it doesn't. But it gets more livable. Eventually. You find ways of living alongside it that don't require you to fight it constantly." Silence on the other side of the wall. A long one. "Yes," he said at last. "I think I am beginning to find that." She picked up her gardening fork. "There is nothing wrong with the basket," she said. "I returned it because I was not sure what it was asking. If it was asking nothing, if it was simply a gesture with no claim in it, then I was too cautious." "It was asking nothing," he said. "Only that you accept it." "Then you could bring another one," she said, very matter-of-factly, as though she were discussing the weather. "If you wanted to." The longest silence yet. She counted it again. 15 heartbeats this time. "I would like that," he said. "Good," she said. She drove the fork back into the earth. "Good afternoon, Mr. von Hartmann." "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ellison." She heard him walk back south along the wall. She kept her eyes on the garden and worked steadily for another hour, turning the soil in the careful, thorough way her mother had taught her. And she did not let herself think about any of it until she was inside, and the kettle was on, and there was no more practical work to hide behind. Then she sat at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. She was not a foolish woman. She was not a young woman. She was 42 years old, and she had lived through grief and hard winters and the particular loneliness of raising children alone, and the further loneliness, quieter but not smaller, of the house after the children had grown and left. She knew who she was and what she was made of, and approximately what she was capable of and what she was not. What she was not capable of, she had believed for some years, was this kind of thing. Whatever this kind of thing was, whatever name it would eventually be given, or not given, she had not believed she was capable of it, not because she was damaged or resigned, but because she was honest with herself, and the honest truth was that after Owen, the idea of something new, something that started, had seemed like a door in a wall that she had simply stopped standing near. Now she was standing near it. She was aware of this with a calm that she did not entirely trust, the calm of someone who has not yet fully registered what is happening, but whose body knows it before the mind has caught up. Her hands on the table were very still. The kettle began to whistle. She got up and made her tea. She would not make anything of it, not yet. She would keep her feet on the ground, which was where she had always kept them, and she would see what happened next, and she would not run toward anything or away from anything, and she would be honest with herself about what she felt when she felt it. That was the most she could promise. She took her tea to the window and looked at the wall. The wall looked back, as it always had, saying nothing. The village of Ashfield was not a cruel place. Mara had always believed this, and continued to believe it, even after November became December, and the conversation started in earnest. She heard the first one second-hand, which was the usual way these things arrived. Dorothy told her, not unkindly, but also not softly, on a Tuesday morning, when Mara came in for bread. Dorothy had a quality that Mara had always valued in a friend. She did not wrap difficult information in so many cushions that you couldn't find it. She simply said the thing. "People are talking," Dorothy said, "about you and the Duke." "There is nothing to talk about," Mara said. "I know that, you know that. But Nellie Birch saw you talking over the wall last week, and Frances has been repeating something she says she was told, though by whom I cannot get her to say. And now people are doing what people do, which is combine two things that each mean nothing, and make them mean something." Mara took her bread. "What are they saying?" Dorothy leaned on the counter. "Nothing vicious, mostly curiosity. Some concern. A few people think it's not proper. A man of his position, paying attention to a woman in a cottage. They're not sure what his intentions are, is what it comes down to." "His intentions," Mara repeated. "And yours, though they're softer about asking that directly." Mara looked at the loaf in her hands. It was a good loaf. Dorothy made good bread, the kind that was worth the walk even in bad weather. She thought about how to answer this, and she thought about it long enough that Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "My intentions," Mara said at last, "are to go home, make my breakfast, finish the mending I started yesterday, and bring in firewood before the rain gets here this afternoon. That is the full account of my intentions." Dorothy smiled slightly. "And the man at the wall?" "Is my neighbor," Mara said, "and grieving, I think, more than people know, and not, as far as I can tell, unkind." She paused. "That's all I can say about him, with any honesty, because that's all I know." Dorothy nodded. This seemed to satisfy her, at least for now. "Just be careful, Mara." "I am always careful." "I know you are. I'm saying be careful in the particular way that applies to this particular situation, which is different from your usual careful." Mara did not ask what Dorothy meant by this, because she knew exactly what Dorothy meant by this. She said goodbye and went home. The concern from her neighbors arrived in two forms. The first form was direct, like Dorothy's, said plainly, with affection, by people who had known her long enough to feel they had the right to say it. These she could manage. These were the concerns of people who knew her, and were doing what people who know you do, which is watch out for you, even when you haven't asked them to. The second form was harder. It came from people she knew less well, people in the outer rings of the village's social life, people who had nothing invested in her personally, but who had strong feelings about categories. A woman of her position, a man of his. The gap between them, which was real, and which no one was pretending, did not exist. Old Margaret Dowell, who was 81, and had been in Ashfield longer than anyone, and whose opinions on any matter were delivered with the calm certainty of an ancient tree, stating a fact about the weather, said to Mara at the well one morning, "I've known women in your situation before. Women who thought a man from a different world was just a man." "And?" Mara said. "And they were right about the man," Margaret said. "They were wrong about the world." Mara thought about this long after Margaret had gone inside. She thought about it while she carried the water home, and while she put it on to heat, and while she stood at the window looking at the yard. She knew what Margaret meant. She was not ignorant of how these things had gone in history, in other places, in other times. She was not naive enough to think that difference in circumstance was no difference at all. Edward was a duke. She was a widow with chickens and a half-acre of vegetable garden and a tin pail that she had bought second-hand from a stall at the autumn market 3 years ago. These were real things. They were not small things. And yet, she thought about his voice at the wall. She thought about the question about the hen. She thought about what he had said, that her mornings had reached something in him that had been closed. She had not been able to dismiss those words, and she had tried, in her honest and methodical way, to test whether she was holding on to them because they were true, or because they were what she wanted to hear. She could not fully decide. That in itself was information. She went on with her days. She did not seek the wall, and she did not avoid it. She went out every morning with the pail, and she did what she always did, and she neither strained toward the wall's presence, nor turned away from it. He was there again. He had come back from wherever he had retreated to, and she could feel him there in the mornings, quiet on his side, not making himself known but not hiding either. It was different now from the first weeks, when she had not known who he was. Now she knew his name, and she knew the shape of his grief, and she knew the quality of his voice. And the knowing changed the feeling of his presence, from something slightly unnerving to something she could only describe, honestly, as companionable. That word made her uncomfortable when it arrived. Companionable. As though they were keeping each other company across a wall, without speaking, in the early morning dark. She tested the word. She tried to find a more accurate one. She could not. The second basket arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days after she had told him he could bring another. She found it the same way she had found the first, on the front step when she went out for the wood. She brought it inside and set it on the table and looked at it with something that was very close to warmth, which she noted and accepted without making a fuss of it. This one had bread again, the same kind, which she had quietly looked forward to without admitting it, and a small pot of thick apple preserves and a bundle of dried herbs tied with kitchen twine, rosemary and thyme, and something she didn't immediately recognize. She opened the bundle and smelled it. Bay, fresh dried bay, bundled with the other herbs. She stood holding it and smelling the clean, particular smell of it, which she associated with winter cooking and the kinds of long, slow meals that fill a kitchen with warmth. There was also, this time, a note. It was folded once and tucked under the pot of preserves. She picked it up. The handwriting was clear and even, neither formal nor casual. The handwriting of a man who had been taught properly, and who had practiced it long enough to make it his own. It said, "I hope these are useful. The bay is from the garden. It grew there without anyone planting it, as far as I can tell. One of the things the garden decided to do on its own. I thought you might want it." That was all. No signature. She did not need a signature. She put the note in the tin box on the shelf above the kitchen fireplace, between two of Peter's letters, without thinking about whether this was a significant thing to do, until after she had done it. Then she thought about it, standing with the lid of the box in her hand. She closed the lid. She made her breakfast, and ate it slowly, using some of the apple preserves on her bread, which was, she discovered, a very good combination. She sat at the kitchen table in the thin winter light and ate with her coat still on, because the morning had been cold and the fire was not yet fully up, and she felt, sitting there in the quiet and the cold with good bread and good preserves and the smell of bay still faintly in the air, something that she had not felt in a long time. She felt, without drama or announcement, happy. Not in a large way, in a small, morning-sized way. A happiness that fit the size of the moment and did not demand anything from her except that she notice it. She noticed it. Then she washed her dishes and got on with the day. She went to the wall that afternoon. She had thought about what she would do for several hours before she did it, because she was not a woman who acted without thinking, and she wanted to be clear in her own mind about what she was choosing. She went to the wall and she knocked on the top of it, twice, with her knuckles, feeling slightly foolish for a moment, which she accepted, and waited. She heard him coming. His footsteps on the other side had become familiar enough that she recognized them now. "Thank you for the basket," she said. "You're welcome. The bay is excellent. I used some this morning." "Good." A pause. "I have more if you need it." "I might, come winter." She paused as well. "The apple preserves are very good. Did you make them yourself?" A beat. "No. My housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, made them. She comes twice a week. She made several jars last month, and I'm unlikely to use all of them. Tell her they're excellent. If you want. Or don't, if it would cause you difficulty." "It won't cause any difficulty," he said. "She'll be glad to know." A small silence, easy and uncrowded, the kind of silence that has been made comfortable by several prior conversations. "My neighbor Frances told me people are talking," Mara said. She said it without preamble, because she had decided she was not going to make a performance of saying it, and she was not going to say it indirectly. A pause on his side. "I'm sorry. Don't be. Don't. I'm not telling you to apologize. I'm telling you because it seems fair that you know." "What are they saying?" "That it isn't proper. That a man of your position paying attention to a woman of mine has implications. That people should be careful." Another pause. And what do you think? I think, she said steadily, that I have not done anything that requires anyone to be careful, and that I don't make decisions about my own life based on what people in the village think is proper. She paused. But I think you should know that this is the conversation we are living inside. I think that matters. It does matter, he said. I won't pretend it doesn't. Good. Pretending things don't matter doesn't help anyone. No, he agreed. It doesn't. A pause. Mrs. Ellison. Mara, if I may. She felt the use of her first name settle in the air between them, like something that had been carefully set down. You may, she said. I am not going to cause you harm. I want to say that plainly. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes or doesn't become, I am not going to cause you harm. Not by intention, and I will try very hard not to by accident. A pause. I understand that is easy to say. I understand that what I am is something the village has opinions about, and that those opinions may fall on you rather than on me. That isn't fair. I am aware that it isn't fair. She stood on her side of the wall and breathed the cold December air. No, she said, it isn't. But fairness isn't always the question. The question is usually something more like, knowing that this isn't fair, what do we do with it? What do we do with it? He repeated. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still working it out. So am I, he said. Good, she said again. That makes two of us. She said good afternoon and went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the wall and thought, two of us. The fire was going properly now, and the room was warm, and outside the December light was doing its brief, thin afternoon business before going dark entirely. She put the kettle on. She took Peter's last letter out of the box and read it again, because she needed something steady and familiar, and Peter's letters, with their big handwriting and their reliable brevity. I am well. The catch has been good. I found a book at a stall which I think you would like, sending it with this. Were as steady and familiar as anything she had. She put the letter back. She put the note from the basket back in beside it. She had not planned to keep the note. She had simply done it. She was, it seemed, a person who was going to keep doing things she had not planned, for the duration of whatever this was. That, she supposed, was something. December came in hard. The first snow arrived on the 8th, which was earlier than usual, and settled on the ground in a way that suggested it had no immediate plans to leave. Mara knew this kind of snow. It was the committed kind, the kind that comes and makes itself comfortable, and expects to be there for months. She brought in extra firewood, and checked the coop for drafts, and put extra straw down for the chickens, who disliked snow with a passionate and vocal consistency that she found, over the years, one of the more reliable things about them. It was in this first week of December that the conversations at the wall became something she would describe, if pressed, as daily. Not planned. Neither of them planned them. They happened in the way that things happen between people who are growing accustomed to each other, without announcement, without ceremony, simply by the fact of both people being in approximately the same place at approximately the same time, and having by now accumulated enough common ground to fill the time between arriving and leaving. He would come in the afternoons, mostly. After she had finished the bulk of her morning work, and before the light went, she would hear his footsteps on the other side, and she would stop what she was doing, the mending, the cooking, the garden work and the parts of the garden that were still workable, and go to the wall, and they would talk. Or he would come to the wall in the morning, while she was feeding the chickens, and this was different. He no longer hid in the dark. He came and stood at the wall openly, and she could hear him there, and she would sometimes say something while she was working, and he would answer. And it was like any conversation between two people who have established that they are not strangers anymore, except that the wall remained between them, and neither of them had yet suggested changing this. They talked about things that did not require much courage, at first, about the weather, which gave them consistent and reliable material, about his garden, which he was beginning to work on seriously, now that some of the structural repair was complete, and which she sometimes gave advice on, not because he asked for it, but because she would hear him describe what he was trying to do, and could see immediately what the problem was. He took the advice without ego, which she noted. She had known men who could not take gardening advice from a woman without some complicated internal machinery engaging. He did not seem to have this machinery. About her chickens, he knew them by sight now. from watching them through the gaps in the wall, and he had begun to form opinions about their personalities, which she found herself defending, or confirming, as though she had been asked to testify on their behalf. He had a particular skepticism about Harold, which was, she felt, not entirely unfounded. About books. He read a great deal. She had suspected this from something in the quality of his attention, the way he listened and referenced things, and it turned out that they had both read several of the same books, which gave them something solid and shared to stand on. He had not expected this, and had not hidden his slight surprise, which she chose not to be offended by because she could see it was not contempt, only the surprise of having your assumptions corrected, which was a reasonable experience for a man who had lived inside one kind of world. About grief. This came later, more slowly, and more carefully. He spoke about Catherine with the precision of someone who has chosen each word and knows what he is handing over. She spoke about Owen with a different kind of care, not precision, exactly, but the careful attention you give to something that is healed, but is still tender. They did not try to compare their griefs or to fix each other's. They simply acknowledged them, held them up to the light, briefly, and then set them back down. This was, Mara thought, the most honest thing two people could do with grief. Not perform it for each other, not compete with it, just show it, briefly, and be seen, and move on. One afternoon in the second week of December, during one of these conversations, he said something that made her stop. She had been telling him about the summer before Owen died, the last full summer they had together, though they had not known it was the last. She was describing a particular afternoon, a Sunday, when they had all gone to the river, herself and Owen, and the children, who had been small then, and Peter had caught a fish, and been so overwhelmed by this achievement that he had dropped it, and Owen had laughed so hard he had sat down in the river rather than fall into it, and she had stood on the bank and watched and thought, this is it, this is what I will carry. She finished the story. There was a pause. You are telling me that happiness can be known in the moment it happens, Edward said. She considered this. I'm telling you that sometimes, if you're paying attention, it announces itself, even as it's happening. I have had that, he said, with Catherine, a handful of times. Moments that declared themselves. He was quiet for a moment. I thought for a long time that those moments were what I was grieving, the loss of them specifically. And now? Now I think I was wrong about what grief is. I thought it was about the past, about the loss of what has been. A pause. But I think it is more about the future, the loss of what would have been continuing. She stood at the wall and let this sit. It was one of the most precise descriptions of grief she had heard, and she had heard quite a few in her 42 years. Because grief was something the world produced in large quantities, and people tried constantly to describe it. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. They were quiet for a moment together. The snow was light and steady. The yard was white. She could see Harold standing in the coop doorway, with the air of a bird who has considered the snow and found it deeply beneath him. Edward, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name, though he had given her permission to do so weeks ago. She had been waiting until it felt like the right moment, which it did now. Yes, he said. What are you hoping for? I don't mean about this specifically. I mean, in general. What are you hoping will happen? The pause that followed was long, but not empty. It was the pause of someone thinking carefully. I am hoping, he said slowly, to stop feeling like a person who is standing on the edge of their own life, watching it, but not in it. He paused again. I spent 17 years being entirely in my life, and then Catherine died, and I stepped back from it, I think without knowing I had. And everything since then has felt like watching something that was once real, but had become, at a distance. And now, she said again. Now, he said, I feel like I am standing slightly closer to it. She did not say anything for a moment. That's enough, she said. For now, that's enough. Is it? Enough is always enough, she said. That's rather what the word means. She heard a sound on his side that was very close to a quiet laugh. She had not heard him laugh before. It was a real sound, brief and low, and slightly surprised at itself, as though he had not quite expected to do it. She made a note of it, without making a production of noting it. I have been told, he said, when the laugh had settled, That I have been in Ashfield for 8 months without speaking to a single person in any real way. Mrs. Peel? Household practicalities. George the foreman. Harold the solicitor. Not your Harold. Mine is a different Harold. He paused. I'm not counting those. So nothing real until now, she said. Nothing real until now. He paused. Is that? I understand it might be strange, from your perspective, to be the first real thing in 8 months. She thought about it. It's not strange, she said. Grief does that. It makes people recede. The world keeps moving, and you stop moving with it, for a while, and then something catches you, and you start moving again. She paused. I was like that too, after Owen. For a while. What caught you? He asked. She thought. Peter needed new boots, she said, and I did not have enough money. And I had to go and ask for work from the woman at the farm up the lane, which was the most difficult thing I had done in months, because I had to stand in front of a stranger and ask for help, which is not a thing I do easily. No, he agreed, it isn't. And she gave it to me, without fuss. She was kind about it, in a plain, practical way. And then I came home and I made a meal, and Peter had his boots by the end of the month. And it was not a dramatic moment. But it was real. It was the real world doing what the real world does, which is continuing and requiring things of you, and occasionally, in the middle of all that, being kind, without a lot of ceremony. She stopped. She had not told that story to very many people. She had told it to Dorothy once, years ago, and she had never told it in exactly this way, with this level of detail, to anyone. She was telling it to a man on the other side of a wall, in the snow, in December, which was perhaps not the obvious setting for it, but it had felt like the right moment, so she had. He was quiet for a little while. Thank you, he said. For what? For telling me that. She pulled her coat a little tighter. The snow was coming down a bit harder now. We should both go in. It's getting cold. Yes. A pause. Mara. Yes. Thank you. For all of it. Not just now. For all of it. She stood in the snow for a moment. You're welcome, she said. Good evening, Edward. Good evening. She went inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at her own 2 hands. They were cold from the weather and rough from the work, and she had had them her whole life, and they were entirely familiar to her. She turned them over, back, the way you turn something over when you are checking whether it is what you think it is. Then she put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the snow come down in the yard while she waited for it to boil. And the wall was white-capped now along the top, and the chickens were all inside the coop where it was warm, and the world was very quiet, and she let herself feel it without examining it too closely. She felt the particular quality of an evening that has gone well, not a dramatic evening, not an evening with big events in it, an evening that had been real, and that she would remember, and that was enough. More than enough, actually. But she had already established that enough was exactly what enough meant, so she did not push it further than that. She made her tea. The letter from Clara arrived on a Thursday in the middle of December, and Mara knew from the weight of it, before she opened it, that it contained more than the usual news. Clara wrote regularly, more regularly than Peter, who was limited by the distances involved in his work, and her letters were generally cheerful and detailed, full of small accounts of domestic life in Ellsworth. Her husband George, who was a reliable, quietly pleasant man that Mara had always liked, their 2 children, who were 6 and 4 now, and apparently spent most of their time at an energy level that Clara described with a mix of pride and exhaustion. The house they were slowly making into what they wanted it to be. Mara looked forward to these letters. They were her window into a life very different from her own, and she read them with attention. This letter was different. It was not unkind. Clara was not an unkind woman. But she had, since childhood, possessed the quality of being very direct when something worried her, which Mara had always respected, even when the directness was aimed at her. The letter began normally enough, the children, a problem with the kitchen roof, George's news from work. Then it turned. Mara read it standing at the kitchen table, still in her coat. Someone had told Clara about Edward. Mara did not know who, did not much care who, but someone from Ashfield, with connections to someone in Ellsworth, had passed on the information that there was a man at the estate next door who was paying attention to her mother. The someone had added, helpfully, that the man was a duke, or had been, and that he had been seen talking to Mara over the wall on several occasions, and that the village had opinions. Clara's response to this information occupied 2 full pages of her letter and was organized around 3 concerns. The first was that her mother had not mentioned any of this in her own letters, which Clara pointed out was a deliberate omission and therefore, in Clara's accounting, significant. The second was the nature of the man himself, his title, his history, his obvious differences from anyone Mara had known before. The third, and the one that Clara circled back to most, and in which Mara could hear the most genuine worry, was whether her mother had thought carefully about what she was doing and what it might cost her. Mara finished the letter and folded it and set it on the table. She was not angry. She had raised Clara to say what she thought, and she could not very well be angry at her for doing it. She was not surprised. She had anticipated something like this, which was part of why she had not mentioned any of it in her own letters, not to deceive, but because she was not ready to have the conversation until she knew more herself about what there was to have a conversation about. She sat down at the table and took out her writing paper and wrote back to Clara the same evening. She wrote carefully and honestly. She told her that there was indeed a man at the estate next door, that his name was Eduard von Hartmann, that he was a widower and a quiet person, and that she had met him because her hen had gone through a gap in the wall. She described what the past several weeks had been, the conversations at the wall, the baskets, the small and careful quality of everything so far. She told Clara that she had thought carefully about what she was doing, as she always did, and that she was not doing anything foolish, and that she was not doing anything reckless, and that she was doing what people who are alive and paying attention do, which is notice when something is happening and see where it leads. She told Clara that she loved her. She told her that she appreciated the concern, and that it was not unwelcome, and that she would keep her informed. She sealed the letter and put it on the table to post in the morning. Then she sat by the fire for a while and thought about something Clara had written near the end of her letter. In the passage that had stayed with Mara most clearly, Clara had written, "I only ask that you think about what you deserve, Mother, not just about what seems possible." Mara thought about this for a long time. What she deserved. It was an interesting way to frame it. She had spent 6 years, since Owen died, not framing things in terms of what she deserved, because she had not found that framing particularly useful. She deserved a great many things that the world had not provided, and the world had provided a great many things she had not deserved, and keeping accounts of this kind generally produced more bitterness than clarity. But she thought about what Clara meant by it, which was something more specific. Clara meant, don't accept less than what is good for you simply because you have gotten used to having less. Don't settle for a conversation at a wall when you deserve a person who walks through the door. This was a reasonable concern. Mara sat with it. The next morning, she went to the wall at an hour when she was not usually there. Not at the feeding time, not in the afternoon, but in the mid-morning, when the light was as good as it was going to get in December. She knocked on the wall twice with her knuckles, the way she had developed the habit of doing. She waited. His footsteps came after a few minutes. "Good morning." "Good morning." She paused. "Eduard, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." A pause on his side. "Of course." "What is this?" she said. "Not what might it be, or what could it become. What is it right now, for you, at this moment? Because I am in a position where people are asking me questions about it, and I would like to be able to answer them, and I cannot answer them if I do not know." The pause that followed was not uncomfortable. He did not rush to fill it, and she did not rush him. "Right now," he said, at last. "It is the most important relationship in my life." He said this simply, without drama, which I am aware sounds large, and I am aware that might not be the answer you were looking for. But I am being honest, as you asked. She had not been expecting this, exactly. She had expected something more careful, something with more qualifications around it. She had not expected the simplicity of it. "The most important," she said. "Yes." Which is not the same as saying I know what it is. "I am not asking anything of you. I am not making claims on anything. I am only answering your question." She breathed in the cold air. "My daughter wrote to me," she said. "She is concerned." "Mothers and daughters," he said, not dismissively, just noting it. "She asked me to think about what I deserve." A pause. "And what do you think about that?" I think it's a complicated question, she said. I think the more useful question is what I want, and I think I have been avoiding asking myself that question, which is unlike me. And if you ask yourself now, she looked at the wall that had been standing for 100 years or more, the wall that had been the boundary of her world, in the most literal sense, for 23 years, and which was also just stone, just old stone, with moss in the cracks. I want to have a conversation with you that is not through a wall, she said. I want to be in the same space as you and see what that is, not because of what it might mean or what it might lead to, just to know. A silence. I think that can be arranged, he said, if you would agree to it. I have just said I want it, she said. I would not have said it if I did not agree to it. No, of course not. She could hear something in his voice now that she had not heard before, something that she thought might be relief. Would you, perhaps on Saturday? There is a room at the estate that I have repaired properly, with a good fireplace. I could make tea, if that seems like a reasonable beginning. Tea and a good fireplace seems like exactly the right beginning, Mara said. Saturday then. Saturday, she paused. Good morning, Edward. Good morning, Mara. She walked back to the cottage, with her coat wrapped close against the cold, and her heart doing something that she decided, charitably, not to analyze in detail. She posted Clara's letter and did her shopping, and came home and mended the last of the aprons, and put a good dinner on for herself for the evening, because she had been eating rather quickly lately, and she decided that this evening she would eat properly, at the table, without hurrying. She did. Saturday arrived with the clean, cold brightness that December sometimes produces between its gray stretches, a sky the color of pale blue china, and frost on every surface, and the particular quality of light that comes from the sun being low and clear. She dressed carefully, not elaborately, carefully. There was a difference. She wore the dress she usually saved for church, which was dark green wool, and fit her well, and which she felt, without vanity, that she looked well in. She put on her good coat. She wore her lighter boots, which were cleaner than the heavy ones. She brushed her hair and put it up properly. She stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and looked at herself. She was 42 years old. She had a face that had been out in all weathers for a long time and showed it in the best possible sense. Not tired, not faded, but lived in. Her eyes were clear. She had not been beautiful in a particular, noticed way when she was young, but she had always been, according to Owen, and she believed him, the kind of person that you keep wanting to look at. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She thought, you are going for tea with your neighbor. That is all. She thought, that is not all and you know it. She thought, yes, but it might as well be, for today. For today it is tea, and that is enough. She put on her coat and went out through the front gate, not through the yard, and she walked around the outside of the wall to the estate's front entrance, which was a set of iron gates that had been cleaned and straightened sometime in the past few months. She pushed one open and walked up the path to the house. He was at the door before she knocked. He had been watching, probably, or listening. He was wearing clothes that were good without being formal, the kind of thing a man puts on when he wants to show he has made an effort without showing that he is nervous, though he clearly was. She could see it in the way he held himself, which was a little too still, the stillness of a person who is reminding themselves to be normal. She had been reminding herself of the same thing all morning. Good morning, he said. Good morning. She stepped inside. The entrance hall was large and cold, as entrance halls in old houses always are, but beyond it was the room he had mentioned, the one with the good fireplace, and it was warm. She could feel the warmth from the doorway. The room had been well repaired, as he had said, and it had a particular quality that she recognized as the quality of a room that has been stripped back to its bones and rebuilt carefully, with attention. There were not many things in it. A table, a few chairs, the fireplace, some shelves that were nearly but not quite full. On the table, a pot of tea, and 2 cups, and a plate of something that looked like shortbread. She sat in the chair he gestured to, which was the better of the two, closest to the fire. He poured the tea. His hands were steady. She watched them while she looked around the room, not wanting to watch him too directly yet, not wanting to make him more nervous than he already was. He handed her the cup. She took it. He sat down. They looked at each other for the first time, without a wall between them, without the distance, without the mediation of stone and mortar. Just two people in a warm room on a cold Saturday morning, with tea in their hands. It was, she thought, both exactly what she had expected, and nothing like what she had expected. He was the same person, the same voice, the same quality of attention, but, in the same room, she could see the things you only see up close. The tiredness in his eyes, that was the residue of 14 months of not sleeping well. The hands that had become, clearly, the hands of a man who had worked with them. The way his face in repose was serious, and in conversation was more open than she had expected. More available. "The shortbread is from Mrs. Peel as well," he said. "Because someone had to say something first." "I assumed," she said. "Unless you've been practicing." "I have not been practicing." "Then it's from Mrs. Peel." He almost smiled. She had seen this before. The almost smile that arrived and then withdrew before committing. She made a note of it. "This is the first time," he said, "that I have had a guest in this house since moving here." 8 months, she said. 8 months. She looked around the room. "You built this well," she said. "The floor. That took time." He looked at the floor, as though noticing it fresh. "George and I laid most of it. It took the better part of 2 weeks. The fireplace surround was replaced. The stones were. The structure was original. 14 inches of stone, which is why it draws so well." He paused. "You know houses." "I know this kind of house," she said. "My father built the cottage. I watched him, and Owen and I repaired it over the years. You learn." "You do," he said. This was how it went. This was the tone and the texture of that first hour in the room together. Practical, careful, built from things they both knew. Houses and repairs and the quality of old materials and the particular satisfaction of work done with your hands. They talked easily, once the first few minutes had passed, with the ease of people who have established their rhythm through prior conversations and are only now discovering that the rhythm transfers to a shared space. She had her tea. She had one piece of shortbread, which was excellent. She sat in the warm chair by the good fireplace, in the carefully built room, and she thought, this is what it feels like to be somewhere new, and have it feel, already, slightly familiar. An hour passed. More than an hour. She stood eventually, and said she should get back. The chickens needed the afternoon feeding still, and he stood as well, and walked her to the door. At the door she stopped. "Edouard," she said. "Yes." This was good. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. It was. "We should do it again sometime," she said, in the same tone she might use to suggest that the garden needed better drainage. "We should," he said, matching it. She put on her coat, and walked down the path, and through the iron gate, and back around the wall to her own door. Inside, she took off her coat, and put on the kettle out of habit, even though she had just had tea, and she stood at the window, and looked at the yard, and at the wall. The wall looked exactly the same as it always had. Everything was different. They did it again the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third Saturday, it had stopped being something they proposed and arranged, and had become simply something that happened, the way certain things, once established, become part of the structure of a life, rather than an event within it. She would come on Saturday mornings. He would have tea ready. They would sit in the room with the good fireplace, and they would talk. Mrs. Peel, who Mara had not yet met, but whose baking she had now come to deeply respect, always provided something to go with the tea, and Mara had started bringing something in return. Once a jar of the apple butter she made in autumn, once a loaf of bread she had made herself, once a bottle of the plum wine that the woman at the end of the village lane made every year and sold without a label. The conversations deepened in the way conversations do when two people keep having them, each one starting slightly further along than the last, building on what has already been established. He told her about his life before Catherine died. He did this not in a single account, but in pieces, over the course of several weeks, the way you tell a life story when you are telling it to someone you are still learning to trust. He told her about his childhood on his father's estate, which had been large and cold, and run with an efficiency that left little room for the kind of small intimacies that families sometimes have. He had been sent to school at 7, and had returned in summers that were orderly and predictable, and not unkind, but not warm. He had learned to occupy himself with books, and with the kind of long, solitary walks that a very large property makes possible. He had learned to be self-contained. He told her about meeting Catherine, which had happened at a dinner that he had attended without enthusiasm, and left very changed. She had been 24 to his 35, which was an age difference that had seemed significant at the time, and had become, over 17 years, entirely invisible. She had been a woman of strong opinions and strong feelings that she did not hide, which had been startling to him at first, and then, very quickly, essential. She had taught him how to be warm. He had taught her, in his quieter way, how to be patient. They had found something together that fitted them so well he could not, even now, describe it without feeling the impossibility of having lost it. Mara listened to all of this. She asked questions sometimes, careful ones, the kind that opened things rather than closed them. She told him, in her own pieces, over her own weeks, the corresponding things about Owen. She told him about the Owen before she knew him, the Owen she had heard about from others in the village, the young man who had been good at everything he tried, and careless about impressing people, which was an attractive quality in anyone, and particularly in a young man. She told him about the Owen she had fallen in love with, which was the same Owen but seen from close up, with all the texture that distance removes. She told him about Owen as a father, which was the thing she thought about most when she thought about Owen. The way he had been with the children, patient and playful, and quietly, consistently present in a way that had shaped them both, in ways that were still revealing themselves. She told him about the last year, and about Owen's death, and about after. Telling it to Edward was different from telling it to anyone else, not because he handled it better or asked better questions, but because he had been where she described, or somewhere near it, and that shared territory made the telling feel, for the first time, like an exchange rather than a report. The last week of December brought a storm that kept Mara indoors for 2 days. The snow came in hard from the north, and the temperature dropped sharply, and she spent those days doing the indoor work, the serious mending, the deep cleaning that the cold weather made her want to do, the letter to Peter that she had been putting off. She wrote it properly this time, longer than usual, and told him about Edward in the same honest terms she had used with Clara. Peter's response, when it came 2 weeks later, was briefer than Clara's, and contained no analysis at all, which was entirely in character. He wrote, "I'm glad you have someone next door. Let me know what he's like. The catch has been very poor this month. Say hello to Harold, the rooster, from me." Mara read this, and put it in the tin box with the others, and felt, for a moment, a wave of uncomplicated love for her son, that was so strong it surprised her. Then she went and fed Harold, and delivered Peter's greeting. January arrived, and with it, a cold that was different from December's cold, more settled, more complete, the kind that stops promising to ease up, and simply is. Mara had spent enough winters in Ashfield to know how to live inside this cold. You kept the fire, and you kept busy, and you went outside when you needed to, and came back in as soon as you could, and you did not spend energy resisting what you could not change. The Saturday visits continued. In January they expanded slightly, not in duration, but in comfort, by which she meant that certain things that had still been slightly formal became informal. She stopped sitting in the same chair every time. He stopped presenting the tea as though it required commentary. She learned that Mrs. Peel came on Wednesdays and Fridays, that the woman was formidable and efficient, and had an opinion about the placement of every piece of furniture in the house, and that Edward had stopped arguing with her about it approximately 4 months ago, and had found this to be a significant improvement. She met Mrs. Peel on a Friday, in mid-January, when she had come to return a book he had lent her the previous week, and had not expected anyone else to be in the house. Mrs. Peel was a woman in her late 60s, with the bearing of someone who had organized things for a very long time, and was not in the habit of being surprised by anything. She looked at Mara for a brief, assessing moment, and then said, "You're the woman from next door." Not unkindly, just accurately. "Mara Ellison," Mara said. "The shortbread from the 3rd week was yours," Mrs. Peel said. "The apple butter from the 1st week was mine," Mara said, correcting the timeline. Mrs. Peel considered this, then nodded, once, as though something had been confirmed. "I'll make the walnut cake next time," she said, in a tone that was not quite an offer, but was something close to it. "He likes it, but it doesn't keep well, so there's usually no point, unless there's someone to eat it." She returned to whatever she had been doing. Mara returned the book. exchanged a few words with Edward, and left. On the walk home, she thought about what Mrs. Peel had said, unless there's someone to eat it, and she thought that Mrs. Peel was a woman who paid close attention to things and expressed what she noticed through practical gestures, which was a quality Mara respected deeply. It was also, she realized, a quality she shared. The village had settled, by January, into a more complicated relationship with the situation than it had had in November. The first wave of concern had passed and been replaced by something more nuanced, a mix of genuine curiosity, some continued unease, and a growing current of something that Mara could only describe as cautious warmth. Several people had come to her directly, not with warnings, but with something more like questions, wanting to know not what she was doing, but how she was. These she answered honestly. She was well. She was better, actually, than she had been. She used a word she did not usually use about herself. She said she was happy. Dorothy, hearing this, had looked at her for a long moment. Happy, she said. Yes. In the way you were before Owen died, or in a new way. Mara thought about this seriously, as the question deserved. In a new way, she said. The same material, but a different shape. Dorothy had nodded slowly, and Mara had seen something in her face that was not quite satisfied, but was the beginning of being satisfied, which was enough for now. What she did not tell the village, because it was not the village's to know yet, was that the Saturdays had begun to include walks. Short ones, on the days when the weather allowed, out through the estate's gate and along the lane to the south, which followed the edge of the hill and gave a long view across the valley below. They walked side by side, not quickly, in the way of people who are walking to walk, rather than to arrive somewhere. They talked while they walked. Sometimes they were quiet. The quietness had become one of the things she valued most, not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of people who have established enough between them that it does not need to be constantly filled. He was not a demonstrative man. She had known this from the wall, and confirmed it in person. He did not make declarations or speeches. He did not gesticulate or perform. He showed things by the quality of his attention, and by the practical care he put into small things, ensuring the fire was good before she arrived, having the right tea because he had asked, and she had told him, once, what she preferred. She had been with Owen, who had been more openly warm, who had said things directly and frequently, and meant them, and this was different from that. But she did not want a copy of Owen. She had not wanted a copy of Owen for a long time. She wanted what was in front of her, which was its own thing. On the second Saturday in February, a date she would not realize was significant until much later, they were on their usual walk along the lane when he stopped. She stopped too. He had stopped to look at something, a small clearing where the snow had partially melted, and the first suggestion, barely there, of something green, was appearing at the base of an old tree. Not flowers yet, just the preparation for flowers, the very first movement of the ground toward spring. He was looking at it with the expression that she had learned meant he was feeling something and was deciding how much of it to show. "Edward," she said. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" A pause. "I'm thinking that I did not expect any of this," he said. "Not this specifically. Not you specifically. I mean, the possibility of any of this. When I came here in February last year, I genuinely believed I was coming somewhere to be quiet for a while. Not to—" He stopped, started again. "I did not believe I was capable of any of this anymore." She looked at him steadily. "And now," she said. "And now," he said, "I would like to tell you something. And I would like to say it properly, which is why I am taking longer than usual." He looked at her with those eyes that had always been present and attentive, and which right now were showing her something that he had been keeping, she thought, at a careful distance for months. "I would like to tell you that you are the most important person in my life, and not in the way of comparison, or by default. In the real way. The way that means I think about you when you're not here, and look forward to when you are, and that the world has become a better place than it was, and that I know I am asking for something, simply by saying any of this, and I want you to know that I am saying it with full awareness of what I am asking." She looked at him. She looked at the small green, beginning at the base of the tree. She looked back at him. "Edward," she said, "I know." He looked uncertain. "You know what, specifically?" "I know all of it," she said. "I have known for some time. I have been waiting for you to say it." She paused. I have also been waiting for myself to know what to say back. And do you know? Yes, she said. I know. She took a breath of the February air, which was cold and sharp, and smelled of coming spring. I feel the same, not exactly the same, because we are not the same, but the same in the ways that matter. You are. You are what I look forward to too. And I am not a person who looks forward to things carelessly. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked at her with that open expression that she had first seen across a cold garden in November, when she came through a gap in the wall to retrieve her hen, and which had not left his face since, not really, underneath whatever else was on it at any given moment. I'm glad, he said, finally. Simply, so am I, she said. They stood there in the lane in the February cold for another moment, and then, with the naturalness of people who have reached something and are content to let it be what it is without making it more, they started walking again. The road curved ahead of them and went down toward the valley, and below, Ashfield was visible in the clear winter light, small and solid, and going about its business, and the estate's wall was visible from this angle too, running along the edge of the property, and her cottage sat next to it, and you could see the yard. You could see the chickens. Harold was standing near the gate, visible even from this distance, in the particular posture of a rooster who considers himself the center of operations. Edward looked at him for a moment. That bird has an extremely high opinion of himself, he said. He always has, Mara said. Is it warranted? She considered. He has kept the flock in good order for 4 years. He has never once been a coward when there was something to be concerned about, and he has maintained the same dignified posture in all temperatures and conditions. She paused. So yes, I think his opinion of himself is largely warranted. I see, I said, and this time the almost smile arrived, and for the first time, stayed. The nephew arrived on a cold Wednesday in the middle of February, 3 days after the walk in the lane where Edward had said what he had said, and Mara had said what she had said. And for this reason the timing had a quality that Mara, even years later, would find almost theatrical in its precision, as though the world had waited until something had been decided before sending in the complication. She did not know about the nephew at first. She heard about him from Francis, who had seen a motor car with unfamiliar plates come through the village on its way to the estate. Francis had, characteristically, noted both the car and its direction, and reported this to Dorothy, who reported it to Mara, in a tone that was carefully neutral in the specific way people use when they are being neutral about something that is not neutral. Someone at the estate, Dorothy said, came yesterday, still there, from what I hear. Mara filed this and said nothing. She did not hear from Edward on Thursday or Friday. They had not established a communication channel beyond the wall and the front gate, neither of them being the sort who sent notes for ordinary purposes, and so when he did not come to the wall and she did not go to the gate, there was no mechanism for knowing that anything was happening, but she felt it, the way you feel a change in the weather before you can name what has changed. She went about her days. She fed the chickens. She went to the village. She did the work of the house. She waited, without calling it waiting. On Saturday morning, she did not go to the estate for the usual tea. She had thought about this, about whether to go as planned, as though nothing was different, or whether to stay away and give him room for whatever was happening. She had decided to stay away, not from pride or caution, but because she thought it was possible that he needed the space, and that if he needed her specifically, he would find a way to say so. She was in the yard on Saturday afternoon when she heard his footsteps on the other side of the wall. She was slow to go to the wall, giving him a moment, and when she arrived, he was already there. I'm sorry about Saturday, he said at once. I should have sent word. I wasn't thinking clearly. There's nothing to apologize for, she said. Who has come? A pause. My nephew, Frederick, my late cousin's son. He has driven from the family lawyers, and has brought 2 of them with him. His voice was flat in the particular way of someone who is controlling their feelings through the quality of their delivery. He is here because the estate, this estate, was not originally intended to come to me. There is a question of the inheritance. Frederick has been building a case for several months, apparently, and has now decided the moment is right to present it. She absorbed this. Is his case strong? He believes so. The lawyers believe so. My own solicitor, Harold, not your Harold, believes we have a reasonable counter-argument. But reasonable counter-arguments are not certainties. What does he want? The estate, Edouard said. Or, if not the estate, a substantial settlement. He was quite direct about this, which I will say in his favor. A pause. He was less direct about some other things he said. What other things? A long pause. She heard him take a breath. He said that I had come here in a diminished state, that his phrase, that I had been not well after Catherine's death, and that this was known in certain circles, and that my activities here, my social activities, were something that people in those circles were discussing with concern. She waited. He meant you, Edouard said quietly. He did not say your name. He said a woman from the village. He said it in the way that people say things when they want to say something, but want to keep their hands clean of having said it directly. Mara stood at the wall. The yard was cold. The sky was the particular white of February that is not bright and not dark, but is simply there, flat and without warmth. She looked at the wall, and she thought about what she wanted to say, and then she said it. What did you tell him? I told him that my social activities were not his concern, and that the woman from the village was not a subject he had the right to raise. And he said, and I am telling you this because you deserve to hear it directly, he said that people in my position have responsibilities that go beyond what a man in a more ordinary situation might be bound by. That my name and my family's name are, his words, not entirely mine to do with as I please, particularly given what I have already done with the estate. She stood very still. He means, she said, that a man of your standing should not be seen with a woman of my standing. That is what he means, Edouard said. Yes. She breathed in the February air. And what do you think? I think, he said, and his voice was steady, but she could hear the effort in it, the way you hear effort when something very heavy is being held carefully, that my nephew is a man who uses the word responsibility to mean do what benefits me, and call it principle, and I think he is wrong. And I think he will probably continue to be wrong in various expensive and inconvenient ways for the foreseeable future. And I am very sorry that any of this has arrived on your side of the wall. Don't apologize for things you didn't do, she said. I'm not apologizing for him. I'm apologizing for the fact that the world contains people like him, and that you are in a position to be affected by them. She thought about Margaret Dowell at the well. They were right about the man. They were wrong about the world. She had thought about this for weeks, in the back of her mind, and she thought about it now in the front of her mind. Edouard, she said. Yes. I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. I'm listening. I have been told, by several people, in various ways, that a man in your position, paying attention to a woman in mine, is not right. That the world doesn't work that way, that I should be careful. She paused. I have been thinking about whether they are right. Silence on his side, not afraid, waiting. They are right, she said, that the world is the way they describe it. They are right that your world has rules and expectations that do not include me, and that those rules and expectations do not disappear because you have chosen not to follow them. They are right that your nephew exists and has lawyers and has opinions, and that these things will not be the last of that kind of thing. Yes, he said quietly. But, she said, and she said it in the firm, unhurried way of someone who has reached the end of a careful thought, they are wrong that those things are the only things that matter. They are wrong that the world's categories are more real than the specific people standing in them. She paused. I am not a category. You are not a category. We are two people who have been talking to each other across a wall for 4 months, and what has been built in that time is real, and I am not interested in letting Frederick and his lawyers tell me what is real. A long silence. Then, Mara. Yes. You are... He stopped, started again. I want to say something that I have been trying to find words for, and I keep finding that the words I reach for are too small. Then don't find the words, she said. Tell me something practical instead. A pause. Then, in a voice that was the warmest she had heard from him, come to tea on Tuesday, if you can. The lawyers will be gone by then, I am told, and I would very much like to sit with you in the room with the fireplace and have tea, and not discuss Frederick. She felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Tuesday," she said. "Yes." "Good," he said. And then, in a lower voice, "Thank you." "For what this time?" "For saying what you said, about reality." She looked at the wall. "I said it because it's true," she said. "I only say things that are true." "I know," he said. "That's part of what I'm thanking you for." She said good evening and went inside. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at her hands again, her familiar, work-roughened hands that had been doing the same work in the same place for 23 years. She thought about Frederick and his lawyers. She thought about the weight of other people's expectations and about how long she had been carrying them without noticing, because they were so familiar. She thought about what it felt like to put a weight down. She made her supper and ate it at the table, properly. And afterward she sat by the fire, and she was not afraid. She was not afraid of Frederick, or his lawyers, or the village's opinions, or the gap between her world and Edward's, which was real, and which she had never pretended wasn't real. She was, she discovered, when she looked honestly at what she felt, entirely sure. Sure in the way you are sure of things that have been tested. Not certain that everything would be easy. Not certain that there were no more complications coming, because there clearly were. But sure of the thing itself, sure of what was real, sure of what she knew about him, and what she believed about herself, sure of the specific and particular truth of what had grown up between two people over a winter, through a wall, in the mornings, while the chickens ate. She picked up her book and read for an hour and went to bed, and she slept immediately and completely. Outside, the February night was clear, and the stars were sharp with cold, and the wall between the two properties stood as it always had, old and solid and moss-lined, keeping its counsel. Spring came in the way spring comes in that part of the country, not all at once, but in arguments. There would be a warm day in March, full of green suggestions and the smell of wet earth releasing everything it had been holding through the cold, and then the cold would return, a last hard frost in the night that made you wonder if you had imagined the warmth. Then another warm day, bolder this time, and then another frost, but lighter, and then the warm days began to outnumber the cold ones, and the argument was settled, and you woke one morning and it was simply spring. Mara noticed spring arriving the way she always had, through the garden, which told her things before she saw them anywhere else. The first showing of the early garlic, the parsley she had thought was dead, coming back in a cluster of bright, foolish green near the base of the pot. The ground changing under her feet when she crossed the yard, softer now, responsive in a way that the frozen ground was not, giving slightly under each step. The chickens noticed it too. They were livelier in spring, more vocal, more interested in everything. Harold resumed whatever seasonal purpose he believed himself to serve, with renewed energy and considerable volume. Beatrice, who had been a source of ongoing management concerns through the winter, had settled into a period of relative calm that Mara suspected was strategic rather than genuine. Frederick had gone. He had left the estate on the Monday after his arrival, taking his lawyers with him, after what Edward described to Mara, only in broad terms, as a full accounting of the legal situation. The estate, it turned out, was less contested than Frederick had hoped. Certain provisions in the original transfer had been clearer than his lawyers had represented to him, and Harold the solicitor had been thorough and prepared, and had produced the relevant documents with the satisfaction of a man who had anticipated this exact moment for some time. Frederick had left without a scene. He was, in the end, a man who did the math. He had done the math and found it did not add up the way he had hoped, and so he had left, which was the most reasonable thing about him, and perhaps the only reasonable thing. Edward had told Mara this on a Tuesday, at tea, with the careful understatement of someone who is not inclined to celebrate but is genuinely relieved. "It's over?" she said. "For now," he said. "Harold advises caution. Frederick may find another angle. But for now, yes." "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. They had their tea, and they talked about other things, and the matter of Frederick occupied exactly the space it deserved, and no more. March passed and April came. The Tuesday teas continued, the walks continued, the wall continued to be a feature of both their properties, and they continued to speak over it in the mornings, because this was a habit that had formed before any of the rest of it, and which neither of them had any interest in stopping. Edward still came in the early mornings. Not to watch from the shadow, not any more. He came to the wall openly, standing in his garden in his work coat, visible through the slats of the fence, and they would speak while she fed the chickens, and it was the simplest and most reliable good part of both their mornings. Mrs. Peel had taken to leaving extra of things. This was her communication style, and Mara had learned to read it. When Mrs. Peel left an extra jar of something, it meant she was pleased. When she made the walnut cake, it meant she was very pleased. In early April, she began leaving things on the windowsill of the estate's kitchen with notes. For Mrs. Ellison, said the notes, in Mrs. Peel's handwriting, which was small and precise and utterly without sentiment. Mara received these and was deeply, quietly touched. Clara came to visit in April, which she had not done in 2 years, and which told Mara that her daughter had made a decision that had taken her some time to reach. Clara arrived on a Saturday afternoon with George and the 2 children, who were exactly as energetic as advertised, and who took approximately 7 minutes to discover the chickens, and then became fully occupied with the chickens for the rest of the afternoon, which was both convenient and alarming. Mara introduced Edouard at tea, which she had arranged at his house, because her cottage did not seat 5 adults and 2 loud children comfortably. Edouard had, as she had expected, made the room excellent. A fire, good tea, Mrs. Peel's walnut cake, and his full and unhurried attention directed at Clara and George and the children in the particular way he had of making people feel that he had been looking forward specifically to meeting them. Clara was reserved for the first hour. This was right. This was Clara doing what she always did, which was look before she committed to anything. She asked questions about the estate, about the repair work, about the garden, that were courteous on the surface, and also, if you listened carefully, assessments. Edouard answered all of them without evasion and without performance, and after about 90 minutes, Mara watched her daughter's face make a small, almost invisible shift. Clara, catching her mother's eye across the room, gave a look that said several things at once, that she had been watching carefully, that she had not found what she had been afraid to find, that she was still not entirely without concern, which was her right, and that she was, perhaps reluctantly but genuinely, willing to trust her mother's judgment about this. Mara gave her a look back that said, "I know, thank you." The children ate a significant quantity of the walnut cake and showed no remorse whatsoever. George, who was a quiet man with a good instinct for people, spent 20 minutes talking to Edouard about the roof of the house, which George had looked at with the trained eye of a man who had recently dealt with his own roof, and made 2 suggestions. Edouard listened to both, asked one question, and Mara could see him filing the answer for later use. After the family had gone, bundled back into the car with a jar of Mrs. Peel's apple preserves and several eggs that Mara had brought over in a small basket, she and Edouard stood at the estate's gate and watched the car go up the lane. "Your daughter is perceptive," Edouard said. "She is," Mara said. "She's also protective, which is the same quality pointing in a different direction." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She loves you very much." "She does." Mara watched the car disappear around the curve. She was afraid that I would be hurt. And now? Now she is less afraid. She paused. She will watch for a while longer. That's her way. But she's less afraid. He nodded. They stood at the gate for another moment. The April evening was mild, warmer than anything had been in months, and the air had that particular spring quality of being something you want to breathe deeply and keep. "Edouard," she said. "Yes." "When you came here last February, when you arrived in Ashfield, did you think any of this was possible?" He considered the question seriously. "No," he said. "I didn't think anything was possible. Not in the sense of believing that nothing would ever be possible again. More in the sense of not thinking about it at all. The future had become theoretical, something that would presumably exist, but which I was not part of thinking about. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I think about it," he said. "That is the largest thing I can tell you. Now it exists, in my mind, as something real and forward-moving. There are things I want to do, things I want to see happen." He paused. "Things I want to see happen with you." She looked at him steadily. "Then let's see them happen," she said. May brought the garden into its full intention. Mara's kitchen garden was ahead of schedule. The early warmth had moved things along, and she had more than she needed of the first things. The herbs, the early lettuces, the radishes that Peter had always liked, and which she grew every year, without being entirely sure why. since she was the only one here to eat them. She began sending things over the wall, not in baskets, not with ceremony, just setting things on top where it was flat, the way you set something on a neighbor's doorstep without knocking. Edouard began helping in the estate's garden in earnest once the weather allowed. She could hear him working on some afternoons, not the big work, which required help, but the ongoing work, the turning and tending that a garden needs constantly. She gave him advice when he asked, and sometimes when he did not, because she could hear in the description of what he was trying to do that there was a simpler way to do it, and she said so. He accepted this the same way he always had, without ego, which continued to be one of the things she liked most about him. She had a growing list of things she liked most about him, which she had not written down, because she did not need to. She had it memorized. The way he listened, the way he learned things, and did not pretend he had known them already, the quality of his silences, the particular way his voice changed when he was saying something he meant very much, not louder, not more dramatic, but more even, more deliberate, as though he was laying each word down carefully where he wanted it to be. The way he had looked at the green, beginning at the base of the tree in February, the almost smile that had, by now, stopping halfway. She had not put a name on it. She had not needed to. It was the kind of thing that does not require a name to be real. It was real the way the wall was real, the way the chickens were real, the way the sound of grain hitting cold ground in the early morning was real, present and particular and entirely itself. One morning in late May, she came out with the pail at the usual time, in the pale, clear light of a morning that had decided to be excellent, and she did the feeding in the way she always did it, from left to right, covering the whole yard so the smaller birds had a fair chance, and Harold stood in his usual spot watching proceedings, with the expression of a man overseeing a complex operation. She finished, and she stood for a moment with the empty pail, watching the chickens, as she always did. She heard the estate's garden gate open, not the main gate on the far side, the small gate in the wall, the one she had not been through since the morning she came to retrieve Beatrice in November. She had heard him working on this gate some weeks ago, rehanging it, which she had noted and not remarked on. The gate opened. Edouard came through it into her yard. He was holding 2 mugs of tea. He had walked from the house with 2 mugs of tea, through his garden, through the gate in the wall, into her yard, and he stood there with the morning light on him, and the tea steaming in the cool air, and he looked at her with the full open expression that she had come to know as well as any face she had ever known. "I thought," he said, "that you might like company." She looked at him. She looked at the tea. She looked at her yard, which was the same yard she had been coming out to every morning for 23 years, and which had never, until this moment, had another person standing in it at this hour. "I would," she said. She hung the pail on its hook by the coop. She took one of the mugs. They stood in the yard together, and they drank their tea, and the chickens moved around their feet, without particular interest in the change of arrangement, because chickens, as a rule, accept new facts quickly, if the facts involve a yard and morning, and someone standing in it with grain. Harold gave Edouard a long, measured look. Edouard looked back at him with the exact same expression. "He's deciding whether to trust you," Mara said. "And?" She watched the rooster. Harold tilted his head once, and then turned away, and went back to eating. "He's decided," she said. "In my favor?" "He went back to eating," she said. "If he hadn't decided in your favor, you'd know." Edouard looked down at Harold's retreating figure. "High standards," he said. "He's earned the right to them," she said. They stood in the yard until the tea was gone, and then Mara went to start her day, and Edouard went back through the gate to start his, and the gate remained unlatched. It stayed that way. Neither of them said anything about it. It simply stopped being latched, and this became the new fact of it, a gate in the wall that was no longer latched, that could be pushed open from either side, that was neither an announcement nor a ceremony, but simply an open thing, the way some things eventually become open after they have been closed long enough. The village noticed, as the village always noticed. The opinion of Ashfield on the matter of Mara Ellison and the man from the estate had shifted through the winter and spring, from concern to curiosity to something that was settling, slowly and not without continued argument in its quieter corners, into the acceptance that is the final stage in the way any community adjusts to a thing that has happened, and is clearly going to continue to happen. Margaret Dowell stopped Mara at the well in June. She was 81 and moved slowly, but her eyes were sharp. "You didn't take my advice," she said. "No," Mara said. "They were right about the man," Margaret said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Mara said. A pause. "And the world?" Mara thought about the world, which was complicated and unfair, and full of Fredericks with their lawyers, and which was also, and at the same time, full of mornings in yards, and cups of tea, brought through gates, and the quality of a voice when it is saying something it truly means. "The world is what it is," she said. "I've decided to live in it anyway." Margaret looked at her for a long moment with those sharp, old eyes. "Good," she said, and she went inside. Dorothy, when Mara told her this, laughed outright. A real laugh, the kind that comes without asking, and said that if Margaret Dowell said good, it was the end of the conversation, and Mara could safely stop worrying about the village. Mara said she had stopped worrying about the village some time ago. Dorothy looked at her with the particular expression of a friend who has known you long enough to know when you are telling the truth, and when you are telling the truth from a slight angle, and decided not to argue. That was June. In July, Peter came home for the first time in 2 years, arriving on a Tuesday morning, with a large bag, and the particular look of a young man who has been away doing hard work and is genuinely glad to be back. He was taller, or seemed it, broader. His hands were the hands of his work, and he shook Edward's hand with them, without self-consciousness, and Edward shook back with his own work-roughened hands, and they assessed each other in the brief, honest way of men who have both spent a good deal of time doing practical things and recognized the evidence of it. Peter had brought 3 things from the north: a bottle of something dark and local that the fishermen made, and which, he warned them, was not for the timid. A book he had found at a market stall, old, a bit damaged, but complete, that he had found because he had been looking for something his mother might like, and this had the right feeling to it, and a small carved piece of driftwood, very smooth, which he said he had found on the beach, and which had no function, but had seemed, he said simply, like a thing worth keeping. He gave the book to Mara, and the driftwood to Edward without explanation. Edward turned the driftwood over in his hands and looked at its shape, which was the shape of something that has been worn down by a long time in water, until all the unnecessary parts are gone. "Thank you," he said. "It's just a piece of wood," Peter said. "I know," Edward said. "Thank you." Peter looked at him for a moment, the same assessing look that Clara had used, though plainer about being an assessment. Then he nodded, once, and that was enough. They had supper that evening in Mara's kitchen, all 4 of them, plus Mrs. Peel, who had come to help and who had brought the walnut cake, which meant she was, in her way, celebrating, though she would not have used that word. They ate at the kitchen table that Mara and Owen had bought at a market 30 years ago, and which had been refinished twice, and had a burn mark near one corner, from an incident with a hot pan that Peter was directly responsible for, and which he maintained, to this day, was not entirely his fault. The kitchen was warm, the fire was good, the evening light came through the window, and lay across the table, and the food, and the people around it, in the long, particular way of summer evenings, in that part of the country, where the light knows it has time, and takes its time. Mara sat at the table in the house she had lived in for 23 years, and looked at the people around it. Her son, home, talking to Edward about the difference between coastal weather and inland weather, with the unself-consciousness of someone who is already past needing to be formal. Mrs. Peel, serving with the efficient grace of a woman in her element, and also, Mara could see, listening to everything, with that small, satisfied expression that meant she had formed and confirmed an opinion. And Edward, sitting at her kitchen table, in her kitchen, in the chair that was slightly better than the one opposite, which Mara had put there without thinking about it, and had only noticed later, and which Edward had sat in without making anything of it, because he was a man who understood what it meant when you gave someone the better chair without announcing it. He looked up at some point, and found her watching him. He raised his eyebrows slightly, not a question, just an acknowledgement. She looked back, and let him see what she was feeling, which was something she had not done with the full and direct intention of being seen in a long time, and which felt, she noted this, steadily and with gratitude, it felt like enough. More than enough. It felt exactly like what it was. The meal finished. The evening went on. The fire settled down to its slow red business. Outside, the summer night was doing what summer nights do in small villages, going quietly about itself, the lane empty, the fields dark at their edges, the sky holding on to a thin last brightness in the west that wouldn't give up for another hour. She would go out in the morning. She always did. She would put on her coat and her heavy boots and take the tin pail from its hook and go out to the yard, and the chickens would come filing out of the coop in their fixed order, Harold first, and she would scatter the grain, in the ark she had been scattering it in for 23 years. And the gate in the wall would be unlatched, and Edward might come through it, or he might not. Some mornings he did, and some mornings he didn't, and neither of those was wrong, because that was the shape of it. The particular shape that had grown up between two people who had each lived long enough to know that the best things are not the ones that take over your life, but the ones that fit alongside it, in the space that is already there. The village would go on having opinions. Frederick would, in all probability, find another angle at some point, because men like Frederick always did, and they would deal with it the way they had dealt with it the first time, without drama, with Harold the solicitor, with full awareness of what was at stake, and full confidence in each other. Clara would come again at Christmas with her family, and it would be easier than April had been, because things get easier when they are real, and continue to be real. Peter would go back north, and the letters would come, in his big, uneven handwriting, from whatever boat he was on, and Mara would keep them in the tin box on the shelf above the fireplace. The chickens would continue to be themselves. Beatrice would find some new way to be a management challenge before the summer was out. Harold would continue to hold an extremely high opinion of himself with considerable justification. And every morning, before the full light, Mara would go out with the pail, and some mornings there would be footsteps through the gate in the wall, and a second cup of tea, and a man standing in her yard in the early morning who had been standing on the other side of her life for much longer than he had been standing in it, watching it from a distance the way you watch something you are not sure you have the right to want. He had the right. He had always had the right. He had simply needed the time to know it, and she had had the patience to wait, and the wall between them had eventually become a gate, and the gate had eventually been left open, and here they were. Here they were. The fire in the kitchen settled again, and sent up a small flare of warmth. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was giving up in the west. Peter said something that made Edward laugh, the real laugh, not the almost laugh, the one that had stopped catching itself, and the sound of it moved through the kitchen, and through the house, and out into the summer night, and if it reached the wall, it would have found it unchanged, old and solid and mossy, exactly as it had always been. Some things don't need to change. They just need to have a gate left open in them. That was all.